Victor Hale tapped his champagne glass 3 times, sharp, deliberate, and the ballroom went quiet like someone had cut the power. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across 500 people in black tie. "Evelyn and I are done." He didn't even look at her when he said it. She was standing 8 feet away, still holding her glass. If you've ever been discarded by someone you gave everything to, stay with me. This is Evelyn's story. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Callaway Grand wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened quietly. It was the sort of ballroom that made people stand up straighter the moment they walked through the doors. 40-foot ceilings, crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, marble floors so polished you could see your own reflection looking up at you like a warning. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was the social event of the year in Harwick City, and everyone who mattered was there. City councilmen, real estate developers, CEOs whose names appeared on buildings, their wives in gowns that cost what a school teacher made in a month. Evelyn Hale had helped organize this event for the past 4 years. She'd spent 3 weeks coordinating the floral arrangements alone. Ivory peonies and trailing eucalyptus, nothing too flashy, because the Whitmore Foundation was about understated elegance. She'd personally called the catering director twice to discuss the menu, had approved the seating chart after 2 full revisions, and had spent the better part of Tuesday afternoon ensuring that Senator Aldrich's wife was seated nowhere near Congressman Petrie's wife, because those 2 women had not spoken civilly to each other since a charity auction in 2018, and the last thing anyone needed was a scene. She was good at making sure there were no scenes. That had been her job for 11 years of marriage. Evelyn stood near the far end of the bar that night, half listening to Patricia Marsh talk about her daughter's upcoming wedding in Tuscany, nodding in the right places and sipping a glass of white wine she didn't really want. She was wearing the deep green gown Victor had said nothing about when she came downstairs. He'd just glanced at her once and checked his phone. The gown had cost more than she would have spent on herself, but she'd bought it because green was his favorite color, and she still did things like that. Still thought about what he preferred, still tried to catch something in his expression that looked like the man she'd fallen in love with. She wasn't catching much of anything these days. "He's going to say something tonight," Patricia said, lowering her voice like they were discussing state secrets. Evelyn looked at her. "Victor?" "Everyone's been talking about the Caldwell merger." Patricia swirled her drink. "If it goes through, Hale Industries doubles in size overnight. Your husband's going to be the most talked-about man in Harwick." "He usually is," Evelyn said, and she meant it without bitterness, because that was true. Victor Hale had a gift for taking up space in a room. It was one of the first things she'd noticed about him, this particular quality of presence. Like whatever he walked toward became more important because of his interest in it. He'd walked toward her once. She watched him from across the ballroom now. He was holding court near the center of the room, a cluster of men in expensive suits arranged around him like planets around a sun. He was laughing at something, that big open laugh he saved for business dinners and important people, and the sound of it reached her even at this distance. His silver cufflinks caught the chandelier light. His dark hair was threaded with gray at the temples now, which somehow only made him look more authoritative, more worthy of the attention he received. She noticed the woman standing beside him. She'd seen her before. Dana Croft, Victor's executive assistant for the past 2 years. 29 years old, a communications degree from Weston University, good at anticipating what he needed before he asked for it. Evelyn had met her at the office holiday party last December. Dana had been pleasant enough, professional, polite. She had the kind of looks that people described as fresh, clean features, easy smile, the sort of woman who didn't have to work very hard to take up space in a room full of men. She was standing close to Victor, not inappropriately close, just close. Evelyn looked away. Patricia was still talking. Evelyn nodded again and excused herself, drifting toward the windows that overlooked the garden. Outside, the spring evening was doing something beautiful. The fountains lit up in soft gold, the hedgerows dark and still. She stood there for a while, letting the noise of the party wash over her without quite touching her. She was 44 years old. She had been married to Victor Hale for 11 of those years, and for 7 of those years she had quietly, consistently made herself smaller so that he could continue to get bigger. She'd stepped back from her position at Hartfield Gallery, not because he'd demanded it, never that directly, but because there were client dinners to attend and networking events to host and weekend trips to arrange, and someone had to do that work, and the gallery had not been particularly gracious about irregular hours. So she'd reduced her hours, and then reduced them again, and then left entirely, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself she'd go back once things settled. Things never settled. She'd become, without entirely meaning to, the woman who stood at his side at events like this one, who made sure the seating charts were correct and the flowers were right, and Senator Aldrich's wife stayed on her own side of the room, who smiled when smiled at and said the right things to the right people, and kept the machinery of Victor Hale's social world running so smoothly that no one ever thought about the machinery at all. That was the thing about being good at invisible work. The better you were at it, the more invisible you became. She finished her wine, thought about getting another. That's when she heard Victor tap his glass. On. It was 3 sharp taps, the kind you did when you were about to make a toast, and the room responded the way rooms full of powerful people responded to Victor Hale. Quickly. Completely. 500 guests turning toward him with their drinks raised or their attention sharpened, the way sunflowers moved without thinking. Evelyn turned too. He was standing near the center of the room. Dana was beside him, which Evelyn registered but didn't think about yet, because Victor sometimes liked to have staff nearby during these moments, people who could handle the logistics of whatever came next. "I want to thank the Whitmore Foundation for another extraordinary evening," he began. The room rippled with polite appreciation, and I want to thank all of you, colleagues, partners, friends, for being part of this journey. Hale Industries has had a remarkable year, and I don't say that lightly. He paused. Victor was a gifted pauser. He knew how to use silence. But I also want to be honest with you tonight. Another pause. Because I think honesty, even when it's difficult, is the mark of someone who respects the people around him. Evelyn put her empty glass on a nearby tray. My marriage to Evelyn is over. She heard it. She processed it. Her mind did something strange in the seconds after. It sort of skipped, like a record with a scratch, going back over the words to make sure she'd heard them correctly. My marriage to Evelyn is over. He still hadn't looked at her. I know some of you may be surprised, Victor continued, his voice measured, almost gentle, the tone of a man delivering difficult but necessary news. But I believe in living with integrity, and that means not pretending that things are fine when they aren't. He reached over, and this was the moment that would replay in Evelyn's mind for years. He reached over and took Dana's hand. Dana and I have found something real, something I haven't felt in a very long time. I wanted you all to hear it from me directly, rather than through whispers. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Evelyn had ever heard. 500 people, not one of them making a sound. And then, like a tide coming in, the murmuring started, quiet at first, then louder, the particular sound of a social earthquake registering on every Richter scale in the room. Evelyn stood very still. She was aware of people looking at her. She could feel it, those glances, the quick cuts away when she caught someone's eye, the ones who didn't look away fast enough and so held her gaze with an expression she couldn't quite name. Pity, maybe. Satisfaction. Discomfort. The complicated feelings of people watching something terrible happen to someone they know well enough to recognize but not well enough to help. Patricia Marsh appeared at her elbow. Evelyn, I'm fine, Evelyn said. The words came out of her automatically, the way they always did. She was fine. Everything was managed. Nothing was going to be a scene. She set her empty glass down carefully on a passing tray, excused herself from no one in particular, and walked toward the exit. She kept her pace even. She kept her chin up. She had spent 11 years learning how to move through rooms without creating disruption. And she did it now the way you did something you'd practiced 10,000 times. Without thinking, without feeling, with nothing but the muscle memory of a woman who had made herself invisible so many times, it had become the only thing she knew how to be. She did not cry until she was in the car. The drive home took 22 minutes. She sat in the back seat of the car she'd ordered. Victor had taken the town car, of course, and she pressed her fingers against her eyes and tried to breathe through the specific kind of pain that doesn't have a clean shape. It wasn't just the humiliation, though that was part of it, burning and bright. It was the quality of what he'd done, the deliberateness of it. He'd planned that announcement, He'd thought about where to stand and when to tap the glass and what to say. He'd stood in that ballroom in front of 500 people who knew her name and her face and the work she'd done for this city, and he had ended their marriage out loud, in public, without ever once looking at her. That detail kept snagging on something inside her. He hadn't looked at her. Even when you fired an employee you'd had for 10 years, you looked at them. Even when you ended a phone call with bad news, you said, "I'm sorry," before you hung up. There was a minimum of human decency that most people extended even to strangers. He hadn't thought she deserved even that. The car pulled up to the house. Their house. A 5-bedroom colonial in Harwick's Westridge neighborhood. A house she had chosen and decorated and filled with furniture she'd researched for months. The lights were on. She thought, stupidly, that the lights were on inside, and she couldn't remember setting a timer, and then the front door opened before she reached it. Constance Hale was standing in the doorway. Victor's mother was 71 years old, a thin woman with Victor's same dark eyes and approximately twice the coldness. She'd never been warm to Evelyn, not from the first meeting, not through the wedding, not through any of the 11 years that followed. But she'd been civil, in the particular way of people who have decided you are beneath their notice and manage you accordingly. She wasn't managing now. She was looking at Evelyn with something that was almost bright. "I thought it best to come by tonight," Constance said. Her voice was perfectly even, given the circumstances. Evelyn looked past her into the foyer. There were suitcases by the door. Her suitcases. She recognized the oxblood leather set she'd bought in a moment of optimism 4 years ago, thinking she and Victor might travel more. They'd barely traveled at all. The suitcases had waited in the upstairs closet like a promise that never got kept. There were 3 of them, packed. "I see," Evelyn said. "Victor asked that the transition happen quickly." Constance stepped back slightly. Not quite an invitation to enter, more like the adjustment of a person who didn't want to be too close to what was coming. He thought it would be better for everyone. Did he? "This house is in the family trust," Constance said. She said it carefully, the way you said something you had been looking forward to saying. "Has been since before your marriage. I'm sure you know that." "I know that." "Then you understand that the legal situation is straightforward." Evelyn walked past her into the foyer. She stood for a moment looking at the 3 suitcases, and then she walked past them and up the stairs, because there were a few things that were hers, not many, she was realizing, but a few, that she was not going to leave behind. Her mother's jewelry box, which lived on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, the portfolio of sketches she'd kept from her years at Hartfield Gallery, a small watercolor she'd painted herself years ago before she'd stopped making things. She found all 3. She brought them downstairs and fit what she could into the largest of the suitcases and set the rest aside because it turned out there was a limit to how much you could carry, and she was not going to ask for anything, and she was not going to beg. Constance was still in the foyer when she came back down. "You'll want to speak to an attorney," Constance said. Not unkindly, more like she was distributing information. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I will." Victor's prepared to be fair. Something moved through Evelyn at that word. Fair. The man who had announced the end of their marriage to 500 people without looking at her once was prepared to be fair. She held on to the inside of her cheek with her back teeth and breathed through it. "Tell him I'll be in touch," she said. She took the handle of the largest suitcase. She opened the front door herself. It was raining. She hadn't noticed, in the car, how hard it had started to rain. A genuine spring downpour, the kind that came in off the bay and drenched everything. The steps were already shining with it. The front walkway was a shallow river. She walked through it anyway. She did not look back. She spent the first night in a room at the Aldgate Hotel, which was the kind of hotel that operated in the space between decent and forgettable. Clean sheets, working heat, a window that looked onto the parking structure across the street. She sat on the edge of the bed in her green gown, still damp from the rain, and she stayed there for a long time without moving. She wasn't sure what she felt exactly. It wasn't one thing. It kept shifting. Grief, then fury, then something that felt almost like relief, which frightened her because what kind of person felt relieved when their marriage ended in a ballroom in front of 500 people? And then the relief would be swallowed by something heavier, the full weight of the situation pressing down. 44 years old, no income, no position, nowhere to live, a career she'd set aside so gradually she'd barely noticed it going. She had a small amount of savings in an account that was technically hers, money she'd put away from her inheritance years ago, before the marriage. Enough to live on for a while, but not enough to be comfortable for long. She had the clothes in 3 suitcases. She had her mother's jewelry and a portfolio of old sketches and a small painting that meant something only to her. She had the name Evelyn Hale, which was his name, and she found she didn't want it anymore. She sat there until nearly 3 in the morning when she finally got up, hung the damp gown in the closet, and lay down on top of the covers without changing. She didn't sleep, but she stayed very still. She stayed in Harwick for 9 more days. She met with an attorney, a woman named Cecile Grant, who had been recommended by Hartfield Gallery's old director, one of the few calls Evelyn made in those first days. Cecile was compact and direct, the kind of lawyer who didn't waste time being sympathetic and was actually more useful for it. She laid out the situation in her office on the 14th floor of the Cresswell building on a Tuesday afternoon. "The prenuptial agreement limits your share of assets acquired during the marriage," Cecile said, "but it doesn't void your claim to the equity you contributed, financially and otherwise. There's an argument for substantial value given your role in his business development, the events, the relationships you cultivated on his behalf." "I don't want his money," Evelyn said. Cecile looked at her steadily. "I understand that feeling. I'd encourage you not to make permanent decisions based on it right now." "I understand, but," Evelyn paused, "I want to know what I'm entitled to. What's mine, not what I'd be fighting him for." They went through it. There was a joint savings account. Victor had already moved most of it, legally, under the terms of the prenuptial, but there was a portion that Cecile flagged as contestable. There was Evelyn's personal savings. There were the items she'd taken from the house, which were hers by any measure. "I'll accept a settlement," Evelyn said finally. "Whatever is cleanly mine. I don't want a protracted fight." Cecile studied her for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What are you going to do?" Evelyn looked at the window behind her attorney's desk. 14 stories up, the city spread out below. The harbor in the distance, the mid-rises of Westridge, the Callaway Grand's roof, visible from here if you knew where to look. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going to leave." She drove north. She didn't plan it exactly. She'd looked at some options, an apartment in another city, a sublet, the possibility of calling an old colleague from the gallery, and all of it felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. Everything in Harwick City was threaded through with the life she'd been living, and she needed to go somewhere that had no thread. She found Seabrook Cove the way you found most things you didn't know you needed, by accident, in the middle of something else. She'd been driving up the coastal highway, thinking she might stop at a town she vaguely remembered from a trip years ago. And she took a wrong exit and ended up on a 2-lane road that wound through low hills with the ocean appearing and disappearing through the trees, and eventually she came down into a small harbor town that looked like it had been there longer than anyone's plans for it. Seabrook Cove was not charming in the polished sense. It wasn't the kind of place that showed up in lifestyle magazines. It was working. A real fishing harbor, weathered docks, a main street with a hardware store and a diner and a pharmacy, and a row of small shops that sold practical things. There was a small arts cooperative squeezed between a laundromat and a boat parts supplier that had a hand-lettered sign in the window, "Studio space available. Inquire inside." She drove through once. Then she turned around and drove through again. Then she parked. The cooperative was run by a woman named Margaret Quinn. Margaret was 73, with white hair she wore in a long braid over one shoulder, and hands that were permanently stained with something, ink or dye, or paint. It was hard to tell. She was small and carried herself the way certain older women did, as though all the unnecessary things had been burned away years ago, and what was left was just the essential part, pure and unhurried. She was working at a large loom when Evelyn walked in. She didn't stop what she was doing immediately. She finished the pass she was on, then turned. "Studio space?" Evelyn said stupidly, because that wasn't quite what she meant. "I have one," Margaret said. "It's not fancy." "I don't need fancy." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Not in a probing way, more in the way of someone accustomed to looking at things closely in order to understand them. "You know how to do anything with your hands?" "I used to paint," Evelyn said. And I have some background in textiles, art direction mostly. I know what things are supposed to look like. Knowing what things are supposed to look like is not the same as making them. I know that too. Something shifted slightly in Margaret's expression. There's a room in the back. $200 a month, utilities included. There's a small apartment above the cooperative. My previous tenant moved out in January. It's a bit rough, but it's livable. $450. Evelyn did the math. She could do this for a while. Not forever, but for a while. I'll take both, she said. The first month was not what she'd call a beginning. It was more like stopping. She stopped performing, stopped monitoring herself in social situations, stopped tracking who was watching her, stopped making herself smaller in rooms. There were no rooms to be small in, just the studio and the apartment and the cooperative's main space where Margaret worked most days and occasionally spoke to her and occasionally didn't. She didn't talk about what had happened. Margaret didn't ask. This felt like grace. She started coming into the studio in the mornings, at first just sitting with the sketches from her portfolio, looking at them like they belonged to someone else. Which, in some ways they did. That version of herself was further back than she could easily see. She started making small things. Studies, a watercolor of the harbor at 6 in the morning when the light was flat and silver and the fishing boats were just coming in. A series of textile experiments with dyes she ordered online and threads she found in boxes in the cooperative storeroom. Her hands remembered things her mind had forgotten. She was bad at first. That was the honest part. She was bad in the specific way of someone who had stopped doing something for 20 years and was rediscovering the gap between what they knew intellectually and what their hands could actually do. She ruined things. She wasted dye. She produced work that was competent in the way a translated poem was competent, technically correct and completely without life. Margaret looked at her work one afternoon without saying anything for a while. "You're trying to make it good," Margaret said finally. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Stop doing that." Evelyn looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You're trying to make something good so that it justifies the effort, so that when you look at it you feel like the time wasn't wasted." But Margaret picked up a piece of fabric Evelyn had been working on, a study in indigo and raw linen. "But you're deciding what it should be before it becomes anything. You're not listening to it." "It's fabric," Evelyn said. "It doesn't say anything." "Everything says something," Margaret said. "You're just not listening yet." She listened. It took months. Through the rest of that first spring, and into summer, and then fall, she was in the studio most mornings and sometimes the afternoons, and she started, slowly, imperfectly, to make things that felt less like exercises and more like something she was actually trying to say. The indigo work kept pulling at her. There was something about the way the dye moved through fiber that she couldn't get enough of. The unpredictability of it, the way the color bloomed and shifted and did things you hadn't planned. She started working in natural dyes exclusively, started reading about the history of textile production, about old traditions of hand weaving, about the relationship between cloth and power and class and survival. She made a piece in the winter of that first year that she didn't intend to be anything, just a large study in indigo and walnut and a strip of undyed linen. She pinned it to the wall of the studio and stepped back and looked at it. It was the first thing she'd made that felt completely honest. Margaret came in to look at it without being invited. She stood there for a while. "How much would you want for that?" she said. "What?" "A customer came in last week. She's been looking for something for her hallway. Not decorative, something with weight." Margaret tilted her head. "How much?" Evelyn had no idea how to answer that question. She'd never sold anything. She'd worked in a gallery, which meant she'd sold other people's things, which was entirely different. "I don't know," she said. "800, Margaret said. "That's a lot." "For what it is," Margaret said, "it's not." The piece sold in 3 days. The woman who bought it called the cooperative to ask if there was more. That was the beginning of the beginning. By the following spring, Evelyn had a waiting list. She hadn't intended to have a waiting list. She'd intended to make things and see what happened. And what happened was that the work, which was not pretty in the traditional decorative sense, which was heavy and intentional and sometimes uncomfortable to look at, connected with a particular kind of buyer. Interior designers who were tired of generic elegance. Collectors who wanted something that felt earned. People who could tell the difference between craft and commodity. She named herself Arya Sterling, and she didn't think much about why. Later she would understand it, that she'd wanted to be someone new, not because she was ashamed of Evelyn, but because Evelyn was still in too much pain to work freely. Arya had no history. Arya had no ballroom where she'd stood holding a glass while her husband announced her irrelevance. Arya had only the work, and the studio, and the harbor outside the window, and whatever she could make with her hands. It was enough. For a while, it was everything. She raised her prices were met. She expanded, hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Lily, who had studied textiles at art school and had no idea what to do with that, and was deeply grateful to have somewhere to go in the mornings. She moved out of the apartment above the cooperative and into a rented house 2 blocks from the water. Still small, still simple, but genuinely hers. She paid Margaret Quinn 4 years of fair rent for the studio, and then she bought the building. Margaret laughed when the offer came through. "You're serious," she said. "It seemed like the right thing to do," Evelyn said. "It is," Margaret said. "I'm glad it's you." Back in Harwick City, things were not going as well. She didn't follow Victor's trajectory closely. She had other things to do. But news had a way of reaching you. A call from Cecile, who had become something close to a friend over the years of managing the divorce paperwork, and then the occasional legal matter. An item in an industry newsletter that a client forwarded. The ambient awareness of someone who had once lived inside a world and could still hear it humming faintly from a distance. Victor had brought in a business partner 3 years after the divorce, a man named Harrison Bird, who operated out of the financial corridors between Harwick City and 3 other East Coast markets, who had a reputation for finding companies in mid-transition and extracting value from them in ways that left the companies smaller than when he'd arrived. Victor had described the partnership, in the press, as a strategic evolution. Cecile had sent her the article with a single line of message. Sounds familiar? The Caldwell merger, which had been Victor's great triumph, had stalled 2 years in and was eventually dissolved at significant cost. A subsidiary that had been Hale Industries' most profitable division was sold off under circumstances that the financial press described as complex. Victor was still on magazine covers occasionally, but the tenor of the coverage had changed, from celebrating to explaining, which was a different thing entirely. Dana Croft, the executive assistant who had stood beside him at the Whitmore Gala in a moment that Evelyn had spent 3 years trying to stop replaying, had become his wife 18 months after the divorce was finalized. There were photographs from the wedding, which Evelyn had not looked at. There was a child, she'd heard, a boy. She did not follow this. She had her own things to do. The brand outgrew the cooperative in year 4. Arya Sterling had become, by that point, something beyond what she'd intended, or maybe exactly what she'd intended without knowing it. It wasn't just the textile work anymore. There were licensed prints, collaborations with 2 sustainable fashion houses, a limited collection of handcrafted pieces that sold through a single gallery in New York for prices that would have made the version of her who'd sat on a hotel bed in a damp green gown genuinely incredulous. She'd also been quietly learning another language. Not a spoken one. The language of acquisition, of corporate structure, of how companies were held and transferred and reorganized. She'd taken courses online at first, then found a financial advisor in the coastal city of Millhaven who took her on as a genuine client rather than managing her like someone who needed protection from her own money. His name was Owen Clark, and he was patient and meticulous and appreciated that she asked real questions. "You want to understand how it works," he said in one of their early meetings. "Yes," she said. "Most of my clients want to understand if they're okay," he said. "You want to understand the machinery. Is that unusual?" "It is," he said. "It's also more useful." She learned, she invested, she made careful, considered decisions that were never flashy and were almost always correct because she had time and information and no pressure to perform for anyone. She didn't have investors to impress, or a board to manage, or an image to maintain. She was a woman in a coastal town making things with her hands and quietly, methodically building something that no one who had known her in her previous life would have recognized. That invisibility, which had once been her cage, had become her advantage. In the 7th year, Owen Clark put a folder on the table in front of her. "Hale Industries," he said. She looked at the folder. She didn't touch it right away. Harrison Bird has been systematically stripping the company, Owen said. Victor knows, or he's chosen not to see it, which amounts to the same thing. 3 of the remaining major investors have been in quiet discussions about a restructuring sale. The company, as it stands, is valued at a fraction of what it was at peak. He paused. If someone wanted to acquire a controlling position, the window for doing that at the current valuation is probably 8 to 12 months. Evelyn put her hand on the folder. She didn't open it. The mansion in Westridge, she said. The one on Elmcroft Drive. Owen checked his notes. Listed 6 months ago. Victor and his wife moved to a smaller property in the Highfield area last year, apparently in response to some cash flow. What's the asking? He told her. She did the math. She'd done a version of this math in her head before Owen had ever put the folder on the table. Not because she'd been planning it exactly, but because she wasn't the same person who'd stopped at Seabrook Cove by accident 7 years ago. She was someone who thought in structures now, who understood how things were held and what it meant when they were available. What do you think? Owen said. Evelyn opened the folder. I think, she said, it's time to go back. The folder sat on her kitchen table for 3 days before she made any decisions. That wasn't hesitation, not exactly. It was the thing she'd learned to do over the past 7 years, the habit of letting information settle before she acted on it, because the version of herself that had been reactive and impulsive had not served her well. That version had trusted a man because she wanted to believe he was worthy of trust. That version had made herself smaller because she thought that was what love required. That version had stood in a ballroom in a green gown and absorbed a public execution with nothing but the muscle memory of a woman trained to cause no scenes. She wasn't that version anymore. She read everything in the folder. She read it once straight through, then went back and read the financial documents more carefully, making notes in the margin in the small, precise handwriting she'd developed over years of logging die measurements and pattern dimensions. Owen had been thorough. There were 12 months of quarterly reports, a summary of the Bird Partnership's structural changes, a breakdown of the remaining investor positions, and a property assessment of the Elmcroft Drive mansion. On the 3rd day, she called Owen. I want to move forward, she said, but I want to do it in the right order. Walk me through your thinking, Owen said. He always said that. It was one of the things she'd come to rely on. He never told her what to do. He asked her to explain herself, and in the explaining, she usually found the answer. The property first, she said. The house is separate from the company. It shouldn't be connected to the acquisition in any way. Different entity, different timeline. Agreed. The company is the more complicated piece, she said. I don't want a hostile move. I want to come in as a white knight, someone the remaining investors see as a rescue rather than an attack. You'll need to get in front of them before Bird does. I know. I need you to identify who's most exposed and most motivated to act. The ones who've been watching the value erode and have run out of patience. Give me 2 weeks, Owen said. You have 10 days, she said. There was a pause on the line. She could hear Owen almost smiling. In the early years of their work together, she'd deferred to his timelines automatically because she'd been trained to defer. It had taken her a while to understand that he actually worked better when she pushed. 10 days, he said. She hung up and looked out the window at the harbor. It was early April, and the light was doing something particular, long and slanted, the way spring light in a coastal town came in at an angle that was almost apologetic, like it was still working up to full confidence. A fishing boat was coming in. She watched it for a while. She thought about the house on Elmcroft Drive. She'd chosen that house, not Victor. He'd given her a budget and a neighborhood and told her to find something suitable, and she'd spent 4 weeks looking at properties before she stood in the empty foyer of the Colonial with its wide plank floors and the arched windows in the dining room, and knew. She'd known the way you knew things that were right before you had a reason. She'd spent months making it into something, choosing things with care, understanding instinctively that a home was a form of argument, about what mattered, about how you wanted to live, about who you were when no one was performing for anyone. And then Constance Hale had stood in that foyer with her hands folded and told her the house was in the family trust. And Evelyn had walked out into the rain with one suitcase, and that was that. She let herself feel it for a moment. The anger, which was still there, quiet and hot, like coals that had been banked for 7 years. She didn't try to put it out. She'd learned that too. eventually, that the anger wasn't the problem, that trying to extinguish it was what created problems, because things you suppressed entirely tended to surface at angles you couldn't control. The anger was information. She used it the same way she used everything else. She picked up her phone and called her attorney. Not Cecile, who was still her attorney in Harwick, but who operated in the personal domain. This call went to a firm in New York, Whitfield and Crane, corporate work, the kind of attorneys who spent their days in the architecture of mergers and acquisitions and thought of companies the way chess players thought of pieces. She'd been introduced to them through a gallery client 18 months ago and had retained them on general principle, the way you kept an umbrella in the car because you lived on a coast. "I have a project," she told the partner who answered. "Tell me," he said. She told him about the house first and the acquisition second, and the sequence she had in mind, and by the end of the call he was doing the thing that attorneys did when something was genuinely interesting. He'd gotten quiet in a focused way, not a concerned way. "This is doable," he said. "The property is clean, the company acquisition is more complex, but the investor situation actually works in your favor." "I know," she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "When you say you want to be invisible until the shareholder meeting, how invisible are we talking?" "Completely," she said. "No one in that building should know my name until I choose to tell them." Another pause. "That's going to require some structure." "I'm aware. Set it up." She ended the call and went back to the studio. Ciao. The studio in Seabrook Cove was smaller than the one she used in the production facility she'd built in Mill Haven 3 years ago. A proper building with real equipment and 6 full-time staff who handled the volume that the brand now required. But she still came back to the original studio most weeks, because it was where she thought clearly, and she needed to think clearly right now. Lily was there when she arrived, working on a new colorway for the spring collection, a complicated layered wash in terracotta and ash that wasn't quite working yet. "The ash is pulling green," Lily said without looking up. "I've adjusted the bath twice, and it keeps doing it." Evelyn looked at the samples hanging on the drying line. "Try cutting the iron content in the mordant. It's probably the water composition here versus the facility." "That's what I thought, but I didn't want to." Lily paused. "You have a face." "What?" "A face like when you've decided something big and you're not sure if you want to talk about it yet." Lily finally turned. She was 28 now, Lily. She'd been 21 when she started, and she'd grown into someone Evelyn genuinely relied on, not just as an employee, but as a person who saw things clearly. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not yet," Evelyn said. "Okay." Lily turned back to the samples. "The iron mordant thing. You're right, by the way. I tested it, but I second-guessed myself." "Stop doing that," Evelyn said. It came out gently. "You knew." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to be okay?" "I'm going to be something," Evelyn said. "I'm not sure okay is the right word for it." She went to her work table and picked up a piece of unfinished textile. A large piece, heavy linen in undyed state, something she'd been thinking about for weeks without knowing what it wanted to be. She ran her hands over it. The fiber was rough and honest under her palms. She didn't work on it. She just held it for a while. Owen called back on the 9th day. He had names. 3 investors, all of them significant, all of them past the point of patience with the direction of Hale Industries under the Bird Partnership. The largest position was held by a man named Gerald Foss, who had been an early backer of Victor's and had watched his investment lose 30% of its value over 4 years. Foss was 70, recently retired from his own firm, and according to Owen's research had expressed his dissatisfaction to other investors in terms that were not ambiguous. "He's the key," Owen said. "If Foss comes on board with your offer, the other 2 follow. He has that kind of weight in this group." "Can you get me a meeting with him?" "I can get you an introduction through a mutual contact," Owen said. "After that, it's up to you." "That's all I need." The meeting with Gerald Foss happened in a private dining room at a club in Mill Haven, neutral territory, which she'd specified because she didn't want to be in Harwick yet. Foss was a square, broad-shouldered man with white hair and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading rooms. He was brought to the meeting by their mutual contact, a woman named Diane Kohler, who ran a sustainable investment fund and had been one of Arya Sterling's first serious financial clients. Foss looked across the table at her with an expression that was not quite skepticism, but was close to it. He'd accepted this meeting as a courtesy to Diane, and he wasn't hiding that. "I've heard of Arya Sterling," he said. "Luxury textiles. Strong margins from what I understand, and a brand position that's genuinely differentiated. What I haven't heard is why Arya Sterling has any interest in a mid-market industrial conglomerate that's been bleeding value for 4 years." "That's fair," Evelyn said. "Let me answer it directly. I'm not interested in Hale Industries for what it is right now. I'm interested in what it can be once the source of the problem is removed." Foss's expression shifted slightly. "The Bird Partnership." "Yes." "You've done your homework." "Enough of it," she said. "I know that Harrison Bird has been operating inside Hale Industries the same way he's operated inside 4 other companies over the past 12 years. He comes in during a vulnerable period, inserts himself into the governance structure, and begins a systematic extraction that looks like optimization until it doesn't." Foss was quiet. He picked up his water glass. "I also know," she said, "that Victor Hale is not a stupid man. He saw what was happening, or he should have, but he needed Bird's liquidity at a moment when the company's cash position was compromised, and he made a deal he couldn't get out of cleanly." She paused. "I'm not here to judge that. I'm here because the underlying business, the manufacturing infrastructure, the distribution network, the client relationships that predate the Bird Partnership, those things still have value, significant value. And I'm in a position to acquire, restructure, and rebuild if I have the support of the right investors." Foss set his glass down. "You'd be taking on a fight with Bird. He doesn't leave companies quietly." "I know. He has attorneys who've done this before." "So do I," she said. "And I have the advantage of not needing the money. He's working against a timeline. Every quarter he holds the position costs him $2. I can afford to be patient." Foss studied her for a long moment. "What's your stake in this?" "Beyond the investment." Evelyn held his gaze. "I have a personal history with the company," she said. "I'm not going to be opaque about that. You'd find it eventually anyway. Victor Hale is my former husband." Foss went very still. "I walked away from that marriage with 1 suitcase," she said. "I built what I've built independently, with no connection to him or his company. What I'm proposing isn't revenge. It's a business case that I believe in, but I won't lie to you about the personal dimension, because you deserve to know what you're getting into." The dining room was quiet. Their food had arrived and neither of them had touched it. "That's either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me in one of these meetings," Foss said slowly, "or it's the most sophisticated play I've ever seen." "I'd like to think both things can be true," Evelyn said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, short and surprised and genuine. He picked up his fork. "Tell me about the restructuring plan," he said. She spent the next 4 months in the architecture of it. That was the word she kept coming back to, architecture. Because that's what it was, a structure, carefully designed, with load-bearing elements and things that were purely aesthetic, and a foundation that had to be right before anything else could go on top of it. She worked with the Whitfield and Crane team, with Owen, with Foss, and eventually the other 2 investors, building the acquisition in layers that were, from the outside, nearly impossible to read. The entity that made the offer for the property on Elmcroft Drive was a real estate holding company with a bland, unmemorable name, Crestwood Properties LLC, registered in Delaware, managed through a layer of normal-looking corporate structure. The offer was clean and above asking price because she wanted it done quickly and without negotiation. It closed in 6 weeks. She did not visit the house. Not yet. The company acquisition was more complicated and took longer, but the pieces moved the way she'd planned. Foss brought the other investors. The Whitfield and Crane team built the offer structure. Owen managed the financial choreography. There were meetings she wasn't present for. Her attorneys represented her interests while she stayed in Seabrook Cove and Millhaven, working, making things, living the life she'd built in a way that she was determined not to disrupt until the moment was right. She heard from Cecile in October, about 4 months into the process. "Victor's been asking around about you," Cecile said. Evelyn looked up from the fabric sample she'd been examining. "How do you mean?" He called an old mutual contact of ours, I won't say who, and asked if they'd heard anything about Evelyn Carter. Not Evelyn Hale. Carter, which was your name before. She'd gone back to Carter after the divorce. It had felt like reclaiming something. What did they tell him? Nothing useful. They hadn't been in contact with you in years. Cecile paused. He's worried about something. I don't know if it's the acquisition specifically. It's possible he's connected some dots. Or possible he's just nervous about the investor movement and fishing around for information. But I thought you should know. Thank you, Evelyn said. Are you sure about the timeline? The shareholder meeting is... I'm sure, Evelyn said. She ended the call and sat for a moment. Victor was worried. She turned that over in her mind without quite knowing what to do with it. There was a version of herself that would have felt something complicated at that. Some residue of the person who had spent 11 years trying to make him less worried, smoothing things, managing things, absorbing things. That residue was there. She didn't pretend it wasn't, but it was quieter than it used to be. She picked up the fabric sample again. The shareholders' meeting was set for the third Tuesday in November. She flew into Harwick City 2 days before and stayed at a hotel in the Millbrook district. Not the Callaway Grand, not the Aldgate where she'd spent that first terrible night, but a small boutique property she'd researched and chosen because it was clean and had good light in the mornings and was unlikely to be frequented by anyone who ran in Harwick City's business circles. She didn't go to the Westridge neighborhood. She didn't drive past Elmcroft Drive. She wasn't ready for that yet, and she'd learned to know when she wasn't ready for things. She had dinner with Owen on the Sunday evening. He ordered steak. She ordered fish. He was nervous in the particular way of someone who had done everything correctly and was now waiting for the part where the real world either cooperated or didn't. You know it might not go the way you've planned it, he said. Everything I've done for 7 years hasn't gone quite the way I planned it, she said. It's gone better, mostly. Or differently. Sometimes both at once. You're not nervous. I'm terrified, she said, but I've learned that terrified and ready aren't mutually exclusive. Owen looked at her for a moment. Can I say something? You're going to whether I say yes or not. He smiled. When you first came to see me, you know you sat across that desk and you apologized for not knowing enough about your own finances? Like you were wasting my time. I remember. I almost wanted to stop you and say, this is the most relevant thing anyone has said in this office, that you knew you didn't know enough. Most people who sit in that chair think they know more than they do. He stabbed a piece of steak. You became the most educated client I've had, and I have clients who went to Wharton. I had a lot of time, she said. It wasn't time, he said. It was what you did with it. She looked at her plate. She appreciated it. She genuinely did. And she also found, as she had found with several such moments over the past years, that she didn't quite know how to receive kindness gracefully yet. That part of her was still relearning. Thank you, Owen, she said. Don't thank me. Just don't let them see you nervous. They won't, she said. The Hale Industries corporate offices occupied 3 floors of the Carver building on Ashton Avenue. She'd been there before years ago when she was Evelyn Hale, and she'd stop by occasionally to drop off something for Victor or attend a company event. She'd known the lobby, the bank of elevators, the particular smell of the place. That corporate smell of recycled air and carpet, and the faint ghost of too many people's lunches. It was the same smell. She arrived at 9:15 for a 9:30 meeting. She was wearing a charcoal suit she'd bought in New York in September. Not flashy, nothing that announced itself, but cut precisely and made of good fabric. The kind of thing that communicated authority in the way she'd learned authority communicated in boardrooms. Her hair was the same color it had been for years. She'd gone gray at the temples and let it happen, had not fought it. And the effect was something she hadn't expected. It made her look more like herself, not less. The receptionist didn't recognize her. Of course she didn't. She was young, probably hadn't been hired until years after Evelyn had been anyone in this building. But Evelyn noticed the flicker of something. A slight recalibration that happened when a woman in a well-cut suit who looked like she was entirely comfortable showed up 9:30 in the lobby. The receptionist straightened a little. Aria Sterling, Evelyn said, for the board meeting. She was shown up. The conference room on the 31st floor was the one she remembered. Glass walls looking onto the city, a long mahogany table that had always been slightly too large for the room. The same set of chairs that had been there a decade ago, reupholstered once by the look of them. There were already people present. Two of the board members she recognized from dossiers, a woman from the legal team, and Gerald Foss, who met her eyes across the room and gave a small nod. Harrison Bird was there. She'd looked at photographs. He was smaller in person than she'd expected. A slight, compact man in his late 50s with the kind of face that was pleasant enough when still and gave nothing away on purpose. He looked at her the way he would look at anyone new in a room he considered his. A quick assessment, a cataloging, the decision that she was not immediately a threat. He extended his hand. "Harrison Bird," he said. "Arya Sterling," she said. Her hand was steady. She'd practiced that in the first year in Seabrook Cove. Not the steadiness, but the not hiding of it. Learning to inhabit her own hands without apology. "Welcome," Bird said. "I understand you're representing a significant new position. That's correct?" "We're always glad to have fresh perspective at the table," he said, and he meant neither the welcome nor the gladness. She could hear the calculation underneath it, the rapid reordering of a man who'd been managing this room and had just discovered an unknown variable. She sat down. Victor Hale was not present when the meeting opened. He arrived 7 minutes late. She heard the door behind her and didn't turn immediately. She heard his voice, a brief apology for the delay, the shuffling of a man settling into a chair, and then she heard the sound of a pause that was longer than it should have been, the specific quality of a room that had changed in the time someone had been out of it. She turned then and looked at him directly. He looked different, not worse exactly, but compressed. The large, confident presence she'd watched command ballrooms was still there in the frame of him, the broad shoulders, the gray at the temples that on him had become more extensive. But there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a watchfulness that didn't quite suit him, like a man who had learned to scan a room because he wasn't always sure what he'd find. He looked at her. She watched the recognition move through him like a current, slow at first, the initial scan of a stranger's face, and then the specific moment when something behind the eyes shifted. She'd thought about this moment. She'd tried to prepare for it. She hadn't been able to fully prepare for it because some things you couldn't rehearse. The particular experience of sitting in a room where a man who had ended your life in public was now looking at you across a conference table and understanding, slowly, that the landscape had changed in ways he hadn't seen coming. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was even. Victor opened his mouth and then closed it. The meeting was called to order. She let the agenda proceed normally for the first 40 minutes. There were quarterly reports. There was a presentation from the finance team about the current position and projected performance under the existing structure. Bird spoke at length about the value of the strategic initiatives he'd implemented. The language was confident and practiced and assembled in the way of someone who had used these particular phrases in other rooms. She listened without writing anything down. She asked 3 questions during Bird's presentation. Each one was specific, referenced exact figures from the financials, and required him to answer in detail. They were not aggressive questions. They were the kind of questions that a well-prepared investor asked, the kind that required real answers rather than the practiced deflection of someone who knew their numbers weren't solid. By the 3rd question, Bird had stopped looking comfortable. Victor was watching her. She felt it, his attention, which had always been a physical thing in a room, like something that actually changed the air pressure. He was trying to understand what was happening, and he didn't quite have enough information yet. When the agenda opened for investor statements, she spoke. She laid out the position her entities held, clearly, without drama. She laid out the history of value erosion under the current partnership, also clearly with documentation distributed to every board member by her attorney who had entered the room quietly at the start of the meeting and sat along the wall. She outlined the restructuring proposal, the changes to the governance structure, the exit terms for the Bird partnership, the operational priorities for the 18-month recovery period. It took her 12 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet in that particular way of rooms where information has shifted the weight of something. Bird said, "I'd like to understand who exactly we're dealing with here. Arya Sterling, the textile company, or..." "Arya Sterling is me," she said. "The entities that hold the position are structured as outlined in the documentation. But if you're asking who made these decisions, it was me." "And you are?" Bird said. She looked at him. She looked at Victor. She looked at the board members and Gerald Foss and the attorney along the wall and the woman from Victor's legal team who had just realized she recognized something and whose expression was doing something complicated. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said. "I was Evelyn Hale for 11 years. I think most of the people in this room knew me then, though perhaps not well." The silence that followed was different from the one at the Whitmore Gala. That silence had been the sound of 500 people absorbing a shock and deciding how to feel about it. This silence was smaller and more precise. 12 people in a glass-walled room on the 31st floor of a building in a city she'd left in the rain 7 years ago with one suitcase. 12 people recalculating everything they'd understood about the past hour. Victor Hale had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and she had seen many of his expressions over 11 years of marriage. It was not guilt exactly, and it was not anger. It was something closer to the look of a man who had made a bet he'd believed was certain and had just discovered the other player had been counting cards the entire time. "The restructuring proposal will proceed to vote," Gerald Foss said into the silence. Bird started to speak. "The votes are already committed," Foss said, and his voice had the quality of a door closing. "The documentation is in order and the position is majority. We can proceed with the vote, or we can acknowledge the result and move directly to the transition discussion. Your counsel can advise you on which is the more efficient use of everyone's time." Bird looked at the documentation in front of him. He looked at the attorney along the wall. He looked at Evelyn with an expression that was assessing rather than angry. A man calculating his next move rather than reacting to this one, which told her something about him that was useful. "I'll need to speak with my legal team," he said. "Of course," Evelyn said. "We've anticipated that. The transition timeline is detailed on page 7. She said it the way she said most things now. Without hurry, without a tremor, without any of the anxiety she actually felt moving through her chest like something electrical. The anxiety was real. The steadiness was also real. She'd learned that those two things did not cancel each other out. Victor spoke for the first time since she'd said her name. "Evelyn." She looked at him. His voice had been, she wasn't sure, not what she'd expected, whatever she'd expected. It was quieter than his public voice, more like the voice she'd heard in the early years, before Hale Industries was what it became, and before she was what she became to him, the management problem he hadn't known he'd acquired. "Why?" he said. It wasn't quite the right question. She'd have more accurate questions for herself if she were asking, but it was the one he had. "Because I could," she said, and then because that was true but incomplete, and because it was the right business decision. "There are 200 people who work in this company. The restructuring plan protects their positions. That matters more to me than anything else in this room." She watched that land. She watched him try to find something in it, evidence of the revenge he would have assumed, the score settling he would have braced for, because that was the framework he would have brought to this. That was how his mind would have constructed it. And she watched him find that it wasn't quite fitting, that what she'd said was both true and insufficient as an explanation, and he wasn't going to get anything more from her right now. She turned back to the room. "Shall we proceed?" she said. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, Harwick City sat in November morning light, gray and cold and entirely ordinary. She could see the harbor from here, distantly, just a strip of steel-colored water between buildings. She'd stood at a different window once, looking at this same harbor from 14 floors up, and told her attorney she was going to leave. She had left. She had built something. She had come back. She had not come back to destroy him. She had come back because the work required it, because the business case was real, because 200 people who'd had nothing to do with a ballroom in 2016 deserved better than Harrison Bird's slow extraction. She had come back because Evelyn Carter had become someone who could, and the world was slightly better organized when people who could do things like this actually did them. She had also come back because she was human, and she was imperfect, and somewhere in the architecture of all the correct decisions and careful structures, there was a woman who had walked out of that house into the rain and needed to know that it had meant something, that she had meant something, that the version of herself she'd abandoned in that ballroom had not been all she was. That woman was present too. She'd been there the whole time. The vote was called. It passed. The vote passed at 11:47 in the morning, and by noon Harrison Bird had left the building. He didn't make a scene. She'd half expected one, or not a scene exactly, but something, some version of the resistant exit that men like Bird performed when rooms stopped belonging to them. Instead, he gathered his materials with the efficient calm of someone who had already begun calculating his next position, spoke briefly to his attorney in the corridor outside the conference room, and left without looking back at her. She watched him go through the glass wall and felt something she hadn't anticipated. Not satisfaction, not relief, but a kind of flatness. The anticlimax of a thing you'd spent months preparing for being over in a moment. Gerald Foss appeared at her elbow. "That went cleaner than I expected," he said quietly. "He'll fight the transition terms," she said. "This was just the first room." "Probably." Foss glanced toward the door Bird had used. "But he knows the documentation is airtight. His attorneys will tell him the same thing." He paused. "You did well in there." "We did well," she said. Foss made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been disagreement. She'd learned that he communicated a great deal in sounds that weren't quite words, and she'd learned to read them. This one was something like, "I know what I contributed, and I know what you contributed, and they are not the same thing." She didn't argue. She was aware, across the room, of Victor. He hadn't moved from his seat at the table. The other board members were in motion, gathering documents, speaking to each other in low voices, the particular activity of people in a room that had just reorganized itself and were working out what that meant for them individually. Victor sat in the middle of all of it like something that had been unplugged. She needed to speak to him. Not today, Masen. Today was about the transition documents and the immediate legal handoffs and half a dozen calls that Owen and the Whitfield and Crane team were waiting on. But soon, there were things between them that the vote hadn't resolved, things that lived in a different category from corporate restructuring and investor agreements. She went to find her attorney. The afternoon was operational. That was the word she kept reaching for. Operational. Because it gave the shape of those hours something useful. She was in the conference room until 3, working through the transition framework with Hale Industries' legal team, who had adjusted with the professional flexibility of lawyers whose loyalty was to the company rather than to any individual within it. The senior counsel, a careful woman named Patricia Hahn, was direct and thorough, and gave Evelyn no indication that the personal dimension of this situation affected her work in any way. Evelyn appreciated that. She tried to match it. There were calls to Owen, calls to Foss, a call to Lily in Seabrook Cove, because Lily had known pieces of this, had understood for months that something large was coming without knowing the specifics, and Evelyn had promised to check in when the day was over. "How are you?" Lily said when she picked up. "Functional?" Evelyn said. "That's not what I asked." Evelyn stood at the window of a small office they'd given her to use for the afternoon. A generic spare room, neutral furniture, a view of the parking structure across the street, which almost made her laugh given where she'd spent her first night back in Harwick all those years ago. "It went as planned," she said. "The vote passed. Bird is out." "That's not what I asked either," Lily said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November afternoon was going gray early, the sky the color of old pewter. "I don't know," she said, which was honest. "I thought I would know by now. I thought the day of it would feel like something conclusive." "Does it not?" "It feels like the middle," she said. "It feels like I'm standing in the middle of something and I can see where I started, but I can't see the end yet." "Maybe that's okay," Lily said. "Maybe there isn't an end the way you've been imagining it." Evelyn considered that. "Margaret used to say something like that." "Then Margaret was right," Lily said. "How's she doing?" "I'm going to see her tomorrow." Margaret Quinn was still in Seabrook Cove, still in the cooperative. She'd transferred ownership to Evelyn 2 years ago, but continued to work there most days, because the loom was where she thought, and she had no intention of stopping thinking. She was 75 now, slower in some ways, no slower in the ones that mattered. "Tell her I said hello," Lily said. "And Evelyn, for what it's worth, I think what you did today was the right thing, not just the business part." Evelyn didn't say anything. "You're allowed to feel it," Lily said. "Whatever it is." Bombed. She didn't see Victor that day. She expected him to seek her out. Some version of a conversation in a corridor, a request passed through someone else, something. He didn't. By the time she'd finished with the legal team and made her calls, his office on the 32nd floor was dark. and his car was gone from the building's parking level. She drove to the hotel in Millbrook and sat in her room for a long time before ordering room service she mostly didn't eat. She opened her laptop and looked at her email. There were 14 messages from Owen, most of them informational updates on the transition documents, and one that was just, "Good day, well done." She read that one twice. There was a message from Cecile that said, "I heard, call me when you want to talk." There were several from the Whitfield and Crane team with attachments she'd look at in the morning. There was one, at the bottom of the queue, from an address she didn't recognize, but she knew immediately when she saw the sender name, Victor. She stared at it for a while without opening it. It had come in at 4:17, which meant he'd written it somewhere. In his car, maybe, or in whatever office he'd retreated to, while she'd still been in the building. She tried to imagine him writing it and couldn't quite complete the image. The Victor she'd known had not been a man who wrote things. He'd been a man who said things, out loud, in rooms, with authority. Writing implied a kind of reflection he'd never particularly valued. She opened it. It was 4 lines. "I know this isn't the right way to do this. I know there isn't a right way. I need to talk to you. Not about the company. About something I should have said a long time ago. I understand if you don't want to, but I'm asking." She read it twice. Then she closed the laptop and got up and stood at the window of the hotel room looking at the street below. The ordinary evening street, people moving through it, a delivery truck blocking a lane, the particular amber color of the streetlights reflecting on wet pavement. She did not know what to do with those 4 lines. That was the honest answer. She'd spent 7 years building toward a clarity of purpose that had nothing to do with Victor Hale's emotional state, and now here was something she hadn't architected for, something that arrived outside the structure of the plan, and she found it pulled at something she thought she'd finished with. She had not finished with it. She hadn't expected that either. She went to Elmcroft Drive the next morning. She'd been putting it off, telling herself there hadn't been time, telling herself it could wait until the transition was more settled, telling herself all the practical things that were also true and were also, she knew, a form of delay. Some things you put off, not because they're difficult, but because they're so weighted with significance that approaching them requires a particular kind of readiness that you keep thinking you have and then discovering you don't. She drove herself. No one else was with her. She parked on the street, not in the driveway, not yet, and sat in the car for a moment. The house looked the same. That was the first thing. She'd half expected it to be different in some way. Changed, smaller, reduced by the distance of years and the way that things you remember intensely often fail to match the memory. But it was the same house, the colonial siding in the color she'd chosen. Not white, but something called antique linen that had been discontinued by the paint company the following year, which had always struck her as quietly fitting. The arched windows in the dining room that she'd spotted from the empty foyer on the day she'd known. The front walkway, which needed the far stone reset. It had been slightly uneven for years, and Victor had never gotten around to it, and apparently whoever had maintained the property for the past year hadn't either. She got out of the car. She walked up to the front door and unlocked it with the key her real estate attorney had provided at closing. The door swung open on the same sound it had always made. That particular weight of a solid door on good hinges. A sound she'd stopped hearing at some point because it had been too familiar and now heard clearly in the way you heard things you'd lost and recovered. The foyer was empty. Victor and Dana had taken the furnishings when they'd moved to Highfield, and Crestwood Properties had not moved anything in. Just cleaned the space, maintained the heat, kept the structure sound. So it was the bones of the place that she was standing in. The wide plank floors she'd spent 3 weekends selecting, the arched opening into the sitting room, the staircase with the turned balusters she'd refinished herself the second year because the contractor's work hadn't been quite right, and it had bothered her until she fixed it. She stood in the foyer. She was expecting something, some large emotional event, tears or anger, or the kind of flooding feeling that people described in stories about returning to significant places. What she got instead was something quieter. It was more like recognition, like the house, and she were acknowledging each other after a long absence, not dramatically, just factually. "You again," the house seemed to say. She walked through the room slowly. The sitting room. The dining room with the arched windows full of November light. The kitchen, which was the same as she remembered, except that someone had replaced one of the cabinet pulls with a slightly wrong match. She noticed it immediately, and it bothered her immediately, and she made a mental note to fix it, which made her almost laugh because that was who she was, and probably who she had always been. And 7 years in a corporate acquisition hadn't changed it. She went upstairs. The bedroom was empty, just the floor and the windows and the morning light coming in flat across the boards. She stood in the middle of it for a moment. She'd slept in this room for 9 years. She'd lain awake in this room more times than she could count, listening to Victor's breathing, thinking the thoughts that people in uncertain marriages thought at 3 in the morning when they couldn't find the words for what was wrong. She'd gotten dressed in this room on the night of the Whitmore Gala in the deep green gown that he hadn't looked at. She stood there, and she breathed, and she let it be what it was, complicated and painful, and also hers, because it was hers now, not despite what had happened in it, but alongside it. She'd learned that from the textile work, that things carried their history, that a cloth that had been through fire or water or hard use wasn't ruined by it. It was thickened, was more itself, had a quality that new cloth didn't have. She wasn't sure she entirely believed that as a personal philosophy, but she believed it enough. She went back downstairs. She sat on the floor of the sitting room. There was nothing to sit on, and took out her phone and called Margaret. Margaret answered on the third ring. "You're in the house," she said before Evelyn could say anything. "How do you know that?" "You're calling me instead of Lily. You only call me when something's too large to say to someone who hasn't known you from the beginning." Evelyn looked at the arched windows. The light was good in this room. It had always been good in this room. That was one of the reasons she'd chosen it. "He emailed me last night," she said. "Victor." "What did he want?" "To talk, not about the company." Margaret was quiet for a moment. The sound of Seabrook Cove was in the background, faintly, the harbor, the particular quality of coastal air that she could almost feel through the phone. "What do you want?" Margaret said. "I don't know," Evelyn said. "I keep not knowing that." "That's not quite true," Margaret said. "You've known what you wanted for 7 years. You built it. You just didn't expect this other thing to still be there underneath it." "No," Evelyn said, "I didn't." "Does it change what you've done?" "No." "Does it change what you're going to do?" She thought about it. "I don't know," she said again. And then, "I think I need to hear what he has to say." "Yes," Margaret said. "I think you do too." She met Victor at a restaurant called Callum's on the north end of Harwick, a place she'd never been to and had chosen for that reason. No associations, no history, just an ordinary Wednesday lunch in a room that meant nothing to either of them. He was already there when she arrived. He was sitting at this table with a glass of water he hadn't touched, and when she walked in he stood up, which was such a particular and old-fashioned gesture that it knocked something slightly loose in her, something she hadn't expected to be loose. He looked tired. She noticed that before anything else. The compressed quality she'd seen in the conference room was still there, more visible without the formality of the meeting setting. He'd lost weight, or she thought he had. It was hard to be sure when the last time she'd looked at him closely. He'd been 41, and now he was 52. He had more gray, and the lines around his mouth were deeper, and he looked in a way that was difficult to categorize, like a man who had been running a long time and had recently stopped. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I almost didn't," she said. She sat. He sat. A server appeared. They both ordered coffee without consulting the menu. There was a silence that she didn't try to fill. "I've been trying to figure out what to say since yesterday," he said. "I wrote about 6 versions of this in my head, and none of them were right." "Then just say the wrong version," she said. "We're both past the point of performing." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. An acknowledgement, maybe, or something close to relief at not having to be careful. "I knew it was you," he said. "Before the meeting. About 3 weeks before." She was quiet. "Bird's team flagged the investor movement, and we started trying to trace the entities. They couldn't get all the way back. Your attorneys built it well, but I found a reference to Arya Sterling in a financial filing, and..." He paused. "And I knew. I don't know how to explain how I knew. I just did. The structure of the approach, the patience of it, the way nothing was aggressive until everything was." "What did you do?" she said. "When you knew?" He looked at his water glass. "Nothing," he said. "I let it happen." That was not what she'd expected. Why? Because I knew I had it coming, he said. And because he stopped, started again. Because a part of me wanted to see what you'd done, what you'd become. I'd been hearing things for years, the brand, the work. I followed it more than I should have, more than was any of my business. He said the last part was something that was almost embarrassment, which was an expression she had not seen on Victor Hale in 11 years of marriage. You were extraordinary at it. The work. I'd look at what Arya Sterling was producing, and I'd think, she always had this. She always knew how to make things, and He stopped. And you, she said. I took up all the air in every room we were ever in together, he said, and I told myself you didn't mind, that it worked for you, that you were content with it. He said the word like it was something he was pulling out of himself with some effort. I think I told myself that because it was easier than knowing the truth. The coffee arrived. Neither of them touched it. Victor, she said, what is it you actually want to say, not the preamble? He met her eyes. I'm sorry, he said, for the night of this gala, for the way I did it, the public of it, He shook his head. I've tried to tell myself it was a form of honesty, saying it in public like that. I've told myself a lot of things over the years about why I did things. But the truth is, I was a coward. I did it in public because I was afraid of what you'd say if it was just the two of us in a room. She looked at him for a long moment. You were afraid of me. Not afraid of you, he said. Afraid of what I deserved from you. Afraid you'd ask me questions I couldn't answer. He paused. You always asked the questions that went straight to the thing, Evelyn, even when I didn't want you to. She picked up her coffee cup. Her hand was steady. The anger was there, still present, 7 years old and still warm. But it was not the only thing present, and she was not going to let it do the talking. There were things that happened in that marriage that I'm responsible for, too, she said carefully. I made myself smaller than I was. I stopped asking the questions. I told myself it was compromise, and it was partly that and partly— She paused. Partly I was afraid of what would happen if I took up more space, if you'd leave. You turned out to be right about that, he said. I did, she said. And I would have found out sooner or later. The fact that it happened the way it did, in that room, in front of those people, that was yours to own. But I don't carry the whole weight of that marriage as only your fault. I know what I did and didn't do. Victor was quiet for a long moment. You're still the most honest person I've ever been in a room with, he said, even when I didn't deserve that. She wasn't sure how to take that. She put her coffee down. How is your son? She said, because it was the thing she actually wanted to know, the human thing underneath the corporate machinery and the history between them. He looked slightly surprised by the question. He's 4, he said. His name is James. A pause, and something in his face changed, became simpler, less constructed. He's good. He likes trucks. He's obsessed with trucks. I don't know where it came from. Neither of us— He stopped, almost smiled. He's good. I'm glad, she said. And she was. That was the genuine thing. The complicated, imperfect human truth of it. She was glad there was a 4-year-old boy named James who liked trucks, and who was, by the sound of it, uncomplicated in the way that small children were before the world got to them. How is Dana? She said. Victor's expression shifted again in a way she catalogued but didn't pursue. We're managing, he said. Things have been difficult. The company, the financial situation, it's been hard on everything. She didn't ask what hard meant. It wasn't her business, and she didn't want it to be. I'm going to be straightforward with you about the company, she said, shifting the weight of the conversation because she felt it needed shifting. The restructuring I've proposed is legitimate. It's not designed to hurt you. You still hold a position, you're still on the board if you choose to stay, and the recovery plan benefits you as much as anyone with an equity stake. I know that, he said. I've read it. I need you to work with me, not against me, for the next 18 months. That's what the transition requires. Not friendship, not— She gestured at the table between them, at whatever this lunch was. Not this, just professional cooperation. You'll have it, he said. I'm not going to be the person who makes this harder. Good. Another silence. Outside Callum's windows, the Wednesday street was going about its ordinary business. A woman pushing a stroller, a delivery driver with a dolly, the particular mid-morning rhythm of a city that did not know or care about the conversation happening in this window table. "The house?" Victor said. "Elmcroft Drive." "Yes." "That was you." "Crestwood Properties." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother told me when I told her we were listing it that it had always been the most honest thing in your marriage. The house. That you'd put more of yourself into it than anything else." Evelyn looked at him. "Constance said that?" "She's not." Victor paused, and something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. "She's not the same person she was. She's been sick. She had a health event last year. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to recalibrate things." He said the last word carefully. "She asked about you a few months ago, just how you were." The news about Constance landed somewhere unexpected, not with satisfaction and not with guilt, but with the complicated non-feeling of hearing about the suffering of someone who had treated you badly and discovering you didn't want more of it. "I hope she's recovering," Evelyn said, and meant it. "She is," Victor said, slowly. They sat there for another few minutes. The coffee went cold. Neither of them ordered anything else. "I want to ask you something," Victor said finally. "Ask." "What you've built, the brand, the work, all of it, does it—" He searched for words, which was unusual enough for Victor Hale that she waited. "Are you happy?" She thought about that seriously, because it was a serious question, and she was someone who gave serious questions their due. She thought about the studio in the mornings and the light on the harbor, and Lily's face when a colorway finally came right, and Margaret's voice on the phone when something was too large to say to someone who hadn't known her from the beginning. She thought about Owen's careful questions, and Gerald Foss's surprised laugh, and the quiet satisfaction of a restructuring plan that was genuinely going to protect 200 jobs. "I'm something better than happy," she said finally. "Happy is too simple a word. I'm myself, completely. Maybe for the first time." He looked at her with that expression she still couldn't entirely name. "Good," he said. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it, which was maybe the most surprising thing about this entire conversation, this entire day, this entire chapter of a life that kept refusing to be as simple as she'd tried to make it. They paid, separately, which was right, and stood outside on the sidewalk in the November cold. "I'll see you at the transition meeting on Friday," she said. "Friday," he said. She turned to go. She'd taken 3 steps when he said her name, Evelyn, and she stopped and looked back. "Thank you," he said, "for what you're doing with the company, for how you're doing it." He paused. "For being what you are." She looked at him for a moment. She thought of all the things she could say, all the years of things that were still there, complicated and real and not going away. "Take care of yourself, Victor," she said. She turned and walked to her car, She spent Thursday in the Carver Building's offices, working through the operational details of the restructuring with Patricia Hahn and the transition team. It was the kind of work she'd come to find genuinely absorbing. The mechanics of how a company could be reorganized so that the people at its core were better protected than the people who'd been extracting value from its surface. There was something deeply satisfying about it, in the way that making a piece of textile was satisfying. You started with material that had been damaged or mishandled, and you worked with what was actually there, not with what you wished it were, until it became something that could bear weight again. She had dinner alone that night in the hotel restaurant, which she didn't mind. She'd learned to be comfortable alone, genuinely comfortable, not the performed self-sufficiency of someone white-knuckling their solitude. She brought a book she'd been meaning to finish for 2 months, and read 40 pages, and ate a bowl of pasta, and drank a glass of red wine, and went to bed at 10. She slept well, which she hadn't expected. Friday morning came in pale and cold, the sky the uniform white of a Harwick November that had decided it was done being interesting. She was in the building by 8:30, setting up the conference room with Patricia's assistant, going through the agenda items she'd prepared. Gerald Foss arrived at 8:50, poured himself coffee, and sat at the far end of the table with the particular air of a man who had made his move and was content to watch what it had set in motion. The other board members arrived in ones and twos. Victor arrived at exactly 9, which was not late. He was wearing a suit she didn't recognize, something he'd bought recently, she guessed, something that fit the version of him that was navigating this changed landscape rather than the version that had commanded it from the center. He sat in his place at the table and opened his folder and did not look at her with anything other than professional attention. She thought, we might actually be able to do this. Then Harrison Bird's attorney walked in, and she understood that the transition was not going to be clean. The attorney was a man named Corey Weld, whose firm had handled Bird's legal position in 2 of the previous company extractions Owen had identified. He was young, early 40s, with the compact, aggressive energy of someone who'd built a career on finding the vulnerable places in agreements. He set his briefcase on the table without being invited to sit and looked at Evelyn directly. My client is contesting the transition terms on the grounds that the acquisition was structured in a manner that improperly concealed the identity of the acquiring party, he said. Without preamble, without greeting, the way men like him opened because they believed the offensive was always the most efficient position. Good morning, Evelyn said. Weld blinked. Good morning, she said again. Please sit down. Your challenge to the transition terms was anticipated and addressed in Section 4 of the original documentation, copies of which are in the folders in front of you. I'd invite you to read it before we discuss anything. Weld looked at the folder. He looked at Whitfield and Crane's partner, who had appeared in the chair to Evelyn's left like something conjured. He looked at Evelyn. My client, your client, she said, retained his position in this company through a partnership agreement that the current board has voted to exercise its contractual right to terminate. The identity of acquiring parties in a private restructuring is not subject to the disclosure requirements your client is claiming. We've been through this with 2 separate legal teams over the past 6 months. It's in the documentation. We'll be filing a motion. You're welcome to, she said. That's your client's right. In the meantime, the transition timeline proceeds as scheduled. If Mr. Bird chooses to seek relief through the courts, that process can run parallel to the operational restructuring without impeding it. She looked at Weld steadily. Is there anything else? Or shall we proceed with the meeting? Corey Weld had the look of a man recalibrating. He looked at the folder again. He sat down. Victor, across the table, had not moved. She didn't look at him, but she was aware of him with the peripheral awareness she'd always had in rooms where he was present. And she was aware that his stillness was not the stunned stillness of the conference room 3 days ago. It was something else. It was the stillness of a man watching someone else hold the room and finding he had no particular objection. The meeting began. She moved through it with the specific kind of focus she'd developed over 7 years of building something from nothing in a studio in a coastal town. The ability to hold the details and the whole simultaneously, to know where each item sat in the larger structure, to stay 2 steps ahead without losing the thread of what was actually happening in the present moment. The transition timeline was confirmed. The operational team leads were introduced. The communication plan for the company's 200 employees was approved. Evelyn had drafted the language herself because she believed you shouldn't outsource the things that mattered most. At one point, Patricia Hahn put a document in front of her that needed a signature, the formal execution of the new governance structure. And Evelyn signed it. Evelyn Carter, in the handwriting she'd had since she was 19 years old, the signature that she'd stopped using for 11 years and then recovered. She put the pen down. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, Harwick City sat in its ordinary Friday morning, traffic and pedestrians and the life of a city that had continued without interruption while hers had been remade entirely. She had come back to this city 7 years after leaving it in the rain. She had done what she came to do. But she was already discovering, with the particular clarity that came after large things, that what she'd come to do was not the same as what she'd needed, and that the real work, the kind that didn't have a vote count or a signed document, was something different and harder and not yet finished. That would come next. The legal challenge from Bird's team landed formally on Monday morning, 4 days after the Friday meeting. Evelyn was in the Carver building when it arrived. She'd taken a temporary office on the 31st floor for the duration of the transition, a practical decision that had nothing to do with proximity to Victor's office on the floor above, and everything to do with the fact that the operational work required her physical presence in the building several days a week. The filing came through Whitfield and Crane, forwarded with a note from the partner that said simply, "As anticipated, we're ready." She read through the filing herself before calling anyone. It was 43 pages, which was theatrical. The actual substantive challenge could have been made in 12, but 43 pages communicated seriousness and resources, which was its own message. The core argument was what Weld had flagged in the Friday meeting, that the layered entity structure used to acquire the controlling position had improperly concealed material information from existing shareholders. It was not a strong argument. She knew it wasn't, and Bird's attorneys knew it wasn't, which meant the point was not to win it, but to cost her time and money, and if possible, attention. To make the transition messy enough that the investors grew tired and the board grew nervous, and some version of a compromise emerged that preserved more of Bird's position than the vote had left him. She'd seen this move in Owen's research, 3 of the previous companies. Same playbook. She called Whitfield and Crane. "File the response by Wednesday," she said. "Don't wait. We can have it ready by tomorrow if—" "Wednesday," she said. "I don't want it to look like we were nervous." There was a brief pause on the line that contained something like appreciation. "Wednesday," the partner confirmed. She hung up and looked at the filing for another moment, then set it aside. The real problem of that week wasn't Bird's legal challenge. The real problem was a man named Robert Calloway. She'd found the name 3 days earlier in a box of documents that Patricia Hahn's team had surfaced during the operational audit. The systematic review of Hale Industries' internal records that was standard procedure in any acquisition and transition. The audit was revealing the expected things: some accounting irregularities under the Bird period, a few contracts that would need renegotiation, the kind of structural deferred maintenance that accumulated when a company's leadership was more focused on extraction than upkeep. But it had also surfaced something older. Robert Calloway had been a business partner of Victor's father. Not Victor, his father, William Hale, who had founded the original Hale Trading Company 40 years ago and built it into the mid-sized industrial concern that Victor had inherited and expanded. The documents were from the late 90s, a series of contracts, correspondence, and what appeared to be settlement records, all connected to a business dispute between William Hale and Robert Calloway that had been resolved in a manner the documents described as mutually agreed private settlement and then never mentioned again. Patricia had flagged it with a post-it note that said, "Pre-acquisition, probably irrelevant, but you should see this." Evelyn read through it twice. Then she called Cecile. "I need you to find out what you can about a Robert Calloway," she said. "Business dispute with William Hale, late 90s. There's a private settlement. I want to know what the dispute was actually about." "What am I looking for?" Cecile said. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. "That's why I'm asking you." While Cecile worked on that, the transition moved forward. The employee communication had gone out on Monday, a letter that Evelyn had drafted personally, direct and specific, telling the 200 people of Hale Industries what had changed in the company's ownership structure, what it meant for their positions, and what the next 18 months were going to look like. She'd asked Patricia to review it for accuracy, and Patricia had changed 2 numbers and returned it with a note that said, "This is the best communication of this kind I've seen in 20 years of corporate law. Send it." They sent it. The responses came back through the general email and through Patricia's office. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. A department head who wrote 3 careful paragraphs about what the previous 2 years had been like under the Bird restructuring. A woman from the accounting team who said simply, "Thank you for explaining it honestly. We haven't had that in a while." A man from the manufacturing floor whose message was 4 words. "We appreciate the communication." She read every one. Victor stopped by the office she was using on Tuesday afternoon. She heard the knock and looked up. He was standing in the doorway in the slightly uncertain way of a man who wasn't sure of his welcome. Which was strange, she thought, because this was technically still his building in the sense that he occupied it. But the geometry of the place had shifted, and they both felt it, and apparently that included the conventions of doorways. "Do you have a few minutes?" he said. "Come in," she said. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the visitor's chair, which she noted without comment, and he had a folder in his hands that he set on the desk between them. "There's something I need to show you," he said. "Something I should have told you years ago, but He stopped. "I want to preface this by saying that I know it doesn't change anything. I know that. but it changes what you know about why things were the way they were. She looked at the folder. Is this about Robert Calloway? His expression changed. How do you know that name? The operational audit surfaced some documents from your father's files. I asked Cecile to look into it. She paused. What is it, Victor? He put his hand flat on the folder. His hand was not quite steady, she noticed. Robert Calloway was my father's original business partner, he said, before Hale Industries was what it became. In the beginning, they built it together, 50-50. Trading company, import, and distribution. He paused. In 1997, my father forced him out. It wasn't clean. There were some financial maneuvers that were legal, but that used information my father had accessed through the partnership that Calloway didn't know he had access to. He diluted Calloway's position and then bought him out at a fraction of what it was worth. Evelyn was quiet. There was a dispute. Calloway threatened to go to the press, to file a lawsuit. My father settled, paid him enough to make him go away, but much less than he was owed, and then Calloway did go away. Victor took his hand off the folder. He had a daughter. She was about 15 when this happened. Her name was Clara. He stopped. Evelyn looked at him. Something was shifting in the room. She could feel it, some weight that she hadn't known was there becoming suddenly, specifically visible. Clara Calloway, she said slowly. She became Dana Croft, Victor said. She changed her name after college, took her mother's maiden name. She went to work in communications. She came to work for me 8 years ago. He met her eyes. I didn't know who she was when I hired her. I want you to know that I genuinely didn't know. Calloway's daughter was a teenager when the settlement happened, and I was in my mid-20s and I barely knew the details at the time. My father managed all of that. I knew there had been a falling out with a partner. I knew there had been a settlement, but the specifics, he shook his head. I didn't know her. When did you find out? Evelyn said. Victor was quiet for a moment. About 18 months after she and I... He stopped, started again. She told me herself. We'd been together about a year and a half, and she sat down one night, and she told me who she was, where she'd come from, what her father had lost. What did you do? He looked at his hands. Nothing, he said. That's the honest answer. I said I was sorry about what had happened to her family, and I meant it, but He paused. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't go back and look at what my father had actually done. I didn't try to make it right. I just absorbed it, and we moved on, and I told myself it was in the past. Evelyn sat very still. She was processing the shape of what she was hearing, not just the information, but the way it changed the architecture of the past. A woman named Clara Calloway, who had grown up watching her father lose everything to a man with more leverage and fewer scruples, who had changed her name and built a career and worked her way into the inner circle of the man who'd inherited what her father had lost, who had... Did she plan it? Evelyn said. From the beginning. I don't know, Victor said. I've asked myself that for years. I think it started as something like that, proximity, being close enough to watch, to understand how it all worked. He paused. But I don't think it stayed that way. I think something real happened, eventually. I think she genuinely, He stopped. I don't know. I'll never fully know. Does she know about the documents in your father's files? She knows some version of it, he said. We never went through it the way I'm going through it with you now. We didn't do that. Evelyn looked at the folder. Can I see it? He pushed it toward her. She spent 10 minutes reading. The documents were even clearer than the ones the audit had surfaced. More complete, including the actual financial breakdown of how Calloway's position had been diluted and at what valuation he'd been bought out. She wasn't a corporate attorney, but she'd spent 7 years learning how to read documents like this. And what she was looking at was not subtle. William Hale had used information he had access to as a 50-50 partner to make a series of moves that left Calloway with no viable options. It was legal, as Victor had said. Technically legal, in the way that many things were technically legal and also deeply wrong. She put the folder down. Your father did this deliberately, she said. Yes. And you inherited the company that was built on it. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. The office had a window that looked toward the harbor. She'd positioned her desk that way deliberately, a small act of continuity with the years she'd spent looking at water when she needed to think. She looked at it now. "Is this why your mother never accepted me?" she said. Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" "Constance. She was cold to me from the first meeting. I always assumed that I wasn't what she'd imagined for you, or that she was territorial, or any of the things that mothers-in-law can be. But it was something else, wasn't it?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "She knew what your father had done," Evelyn said. "She knew more than I did," Victor said. "She was part of it, in a limited way. She'd helped my father manage the social side of pushing Calloway out, making sure the right people knew the right version of events. She spent years keeping that version in place." He paused. "When I married you, you were an outsider," Evelyn said. "Someone who might ask questions. Someone who was perceptive enough to eventually see things that were meant to stay unseen," he said. "She never trusted you because of that, not because of anything you did." Evelyn looked at the folder. She thought about 11 years of Constance Hale's careful management. The coolness, the distance, the particular quality of being tolerated rather than welcomed in a house and a family and a social world that she'd worked hard to support. She thought about standing in the foyer of the Elmcroft Drive house while Constance explained in even tones that the property was in the family trust, while the packed suitcases sat by the door like a sentence that had already been written. She thought about the rain. The anger was there, a different shade of it now, older and more complicated. Not clean fury, but the heavy, slow-burning thing of understanding that the pattern of her treatment had a reason, and the reason was fear. And fear was the least dignified possible basis for a decade of deliberate exclusion. "Did it ever occur to you," she said, "to tell me any of this, at any point during 11 years of marriage?" "No," he said. "Why not?" "Because then I would have had to admit what kind of company I was running," he said, "what it was built on, and He stopped. "I wanted to believe I'd made something separate from what my father had done. That what Hale Industries was by the time I inherited it was legitimate because of what I'd done with it, regardless of how it started." "That's not how it works," she said. "I know that now," he said. "I've known it for a while." She pushed the folder back toward him. "There's something I need you to understand," she said. "This changes the context. It doesn't change the facts of what happened between us, but it gives them a shape I didn't have before." She paused. "I need to think about what to do with this." "About the Calloway situation?" "Yes." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Robert Calloway is... How old would he be now?" Victor thought for a moment. 73, 74? "Is he alive?" "I don't know. I haven't..." He stopped. "I haven't looked." "I think we need to find out," she said. Cecile called that evening with what she'd found. Robert Calloway was alive. He was 74 years old, and he lived in a small town called Garner's Point, 2 hours north of Harwick, in a house that property records showed he'd owned for 18 years. There was not much else in the public record. No business activity, no legal filings, no particular footprint. A man who had been removed from his own life in his mid-40s and had apparently been living quietly on whatever the settlement had provided. "I found one other thing," Cecile said. "He had a medical debt filed in 2019. Significant. It was resolved, but..." "How significant?" Evelyn said. Cecile told her. Evelyn was quiet. "Are you going to contact him?" Cecile said. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. That's not simply my decision to make." She thought about Dana, the woman who had stood beside Victor at the Whitmore Gala, whose hand he'd taken in front of 500 people, whose presence in his life had dismantled Evelyn's, or had been the instrument of the dismantling, at least, in the way that a key is the instrument of a lock opening, and the real question is who built the lock and why. She thought about a 15-year-old girl watching her family lose something that had been taken from them, and the particular way that kind of loss got into a person. She didn't know what Dana had intended. She didn't know how much had been planned and how much had become something else. But she knew that underneath all of it was Robert Calloway in a house in Garner's Point, 74 years old with a resolved medical debt, who had never gotten what he was actually owed. That mattered. Independently of everything else, it mattered. She called Victor the next morning. "I want to do something about the Calloway situation," she said. "Not for you, and not for Dana. For him." A pause on the line. "What are you thinking?" "A proper settlement," she said. "What he was actually owed. A fair valuation of his position at the time it was taken from him, with appropriate adjustment. The company can do this through a structured resolution. It would need to be acknowledged as a historical wrong by the company, which means by the current board. You'd be asking me to admit publicly that my father I'm asking you to do the right thing," she said, "which is different from a public admission in terms of the legal structure. Cecile and your attorneys can find a way to do this that protects the company appropriately, but the substance of it has to be real. It can't be a gesture." He was quiet for a long time. "There's something else," she said. "Dana should be part of this conversation. I think she deserves that." "Evelyn." "I know," she said. "I know how complicated that is. I'm not asking you to arrange a dinner. I'm saying that this started with her family, and she should know what's happening with it. That's between you and her, but I think it matters." Another long pause. When Victor spoke again, his voice had something in it she hadn't heard in a very long time. Not since the early years, before Hale Industries became what it became, and before he became who he became inside it. Something that was almost stripped down, almost just the person rather than the position. "How did you become this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. It was more like something said out loud that had been internal for a while. "I had time," she said, "and I had people around me who were worth paying attention to." "I'm going to think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking." Cecile came to Harwick on Thursday. They met at a coffee shop near the Cresswell building. Not the hotel, not the Carver building, neutral territory in the way that Callum's had been neutral territory, a place that belonged to neither of them and therefore to both. Cecile arrived with a leather portfolio and ordered an oat milk latte without looking at the menu, which was a detail that made Evelyn feel oddly like something was right in the world. "Victor's attorney called this morning," Cecile said. "He's agreed to the Calloway resolution in principle. The board will need to ratify it, which your restructured governance can do in the next meeting cycle." "Good," Evelyn said. "It's going to be a real number," Cecile said. "When you account for the original value and the years—" "It should be," Evelyn said. Cecile looked at her over the edge of her latte. "Most people in your position would not be the one driving this. Most people in my position didn't spend 7 years watching a woman named Margaret Quinn work at a loom and tell them that everything says something if you're willing to listen." Cecile blinked. "That's either very wise or very obscure." "Probably both," Evelyn said. "What I mean is, I've spent 7 years building something. I understand now the particular kind of damage that's done when someone takes what you've built and dismantles it for their own use. I understand it because I lived it." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Robert Calloway is 74 years old, and he's been living with that damage for 30 years. That's not abstract to me." "And Dana?" Cecile said. "That's not mine to resolve," Evelyn said. "That's between her and Victor, and probably between her and her father. I've said what I have to say about it." Cecile nodded slowly. "There's something I want to ask you," she said, "completely off the record, as your attorney, and also someone who has watched you navigate the past 7 years of your life. Ask. Do you regret any of it? Not the marriage, not the easy version of that question. I mean the way you did this. The 7 years of building before coming back, the structure of the acquisition, the way it played out in that meeting. Is there anything you would have done differently?" Evelyn considered it honestly, the way she'd come to consider most things, not to arrive at the right-sounding answer, but to find out what she actually thought. "I would have done the Calloway piece earlier," she said finally. "Not the financial resolution. I couldn't have known about that until the audit, but the larger principle, that what had been done wrong to someone else was part of the same pattern as what was done wrong to me. I focused so completely on my own piece of it that I was halfway through before I could see the larger shape." She paused. "I don't think I could have seen it sooner. I wasn't ready to see it sooner. But if I could tell myself something 7 years ago, it would be, your story is part of something bigger than your story." Cecile was quiet for a moment. "That's what most people never figure out," she said. Margaret figured it out before I did, Evelyn said. She always does. But the week before Thanksgiving, Constance Hale asked to see her. The request came through Victor. A brief message that said, "My mother has asked if you'd be willing to visit. I told her I would ask and respect whatever you decided. There's no obligation." Evelyn read it twice. Then she set the phone down and went to stand at the window of the office she'd been using in the Carver building, the one she'd positioned to face the harbor, and she stood there for a while. She thought about obligation, about the things you owed people and the things you didn't, and the difficulty of distinguishing between them when history had wrapped itself so thickly around the question that you couldn't find the clean edge of it. She didn't owe Constance Hale anything. That was a clear and accurate statement. She didn't owe her a visit or her time or the considerable emotional resources that a conversation with the woman would require. But there was a difference between what you owed and what you chose. She'd built her life in the past 7 years on that distinction. On choosing things not because they were required, but because they were right. Because they moved the world in a direction that was slightly better than it would have been without her effort. Sometimes that was a textile piece. Sometimes it was a restructuring plan. Sometimes it was a phone call to Owen about a timeline. Maybe sometimes it was an old woman who was sick and had done damage and knew it and was asking. She messaged Victor back. "I'll go. Tell her Thursday afternoon." The house in Highfield was a good deal smaller than the Elmcroft property. Not small, but scaled to 2 people rather than 5. A brick 2-story on a quiet street with a garden that had been better maintained than the house suggested. Victor met her at the door. "She's in the sitting room," he said. "She has good days and bad days. Today is a good one." "That's good," Evelyn said. He stepped back to let her in. He looked like he hadn't slept well. She didn't ask about it. Constance was in an armchair by the window, smaller than Evelyn remembered, and Evelyn had always thought of her as a small woman, but illness had done something to the particular authority that had made her seem larger than her frame. She was wrapped in a cashmere blanket that Evelyn recognized. She'd given it to Constance for Christmas, years ago, which was a detail she hadn't expected to feel anything about, and found she did. Constance looked at her when she came in. "You look well," Constance said. Her voice was still precise, still carried the quality of a woman who had always controlled the register of her own speech. But it was quieter. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She sat in the chair across from her. Not close, not distant. The distance of 2 people who had never sat easily together and were not pretending otherwise. They were quiet for a moment. Through the window, the Highfield garden was late November bare, the ground dark, the trees stripped. "Victor told me what you've done," Constance said, "with the company. The Callaway resolution." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Robert Callaway was a decent man," Constance said. "William was not always decent in business. I knew that. I helped keep it quiet, which I'm not proud of." She said it with the directness of someone who had been through the particular refinement that serious illness sometimes produced, when you had less time and less energy to spend on performance. "I was never kind to you," she said, "because I was afraid you'd see things clearly." "I did eventually," Evelyn said. "Later than I deserved," Constance said, "though perhaps earlier than I feared." Evelyn looked at her. "What is it you want, Constance?" The old woman was quiet for a moment. Her hands were in her lap, very still. "I'm not sure I have the right to want anything from you," she said. "I don't think I'm asking for forgiveness. I don't think that's something that should be asked for, as a thing owed." She paused. "I wanted you to know that I understand what was done, the full shape of it, what we did to you, and what my son did to you, and the part I played in making you feel like an outsider in a family that had no ground to stand on." Evelyn was quiet. "You built something extraordinary," Constance said. "I've followed it, the brand, the work. Victor used to leave things lying around, articles, photographs. I think he forgot I was in the same house. Or perhaps he didn't forget." She looked out the window. "What you made is better than anything this family has produced." "I made it because I had to," Evelyn said, "because there was nothing else." "I know," Constance said. "That's what I'm saying." They sat together for another 40 minutes. They did not resolve anything, exactly. There was no clean resolution available, and Evelyn was not in the business of manufacturing one. But they talked. About Seabrook Cove, which Constance had never visited but had an image of from somewhere. About Margaret Quinn, whose name made Constance look thoughtful in the way of someone hearing about a person they would have liked. About James, the 4-year-old who liked trucks, who Constance clearly adored in the particular way of grandmothers who had not been especially warm in any other configuration. When Evelyn stood to leave, Constance didn't stand. She couldn't, easily, and didn't pretend. But she reached out and put her hand briefly on Evelyn's arm as she passed, and Evelyn stopped, and for a moment they were just two women in a room in November, both of them carrying more than they'd asked to carry. "Take care of yourself," Evelyn said. "I'm trying," Constance said. "It's harder than it used to be." Victor walked her to the door. They stood on the front step in the cold afternoon. She could hear, faintly from somewhere in the house, the sound of a small child, the particular sound of a 4-year-old at play, the running narrative of a child who talked to himself while he did things, the occasional emphatic statement addressed to a truck or a block, or nothing at all. "How was that?" Victor said. "Hard," she said, "and necessary, and not a thing I need to do again soon." "That's fair." She started toward her car. "Evelyn," he said, behind her. She turned. "The Callaway resolution," he said. "The board approved it this morning. It's going forward." He paused. "Thank you for pushing on that." She looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the street, low and golden, the particular quality of light at the end of a November day when it was almost done but hadn't quite admitted it. "It was the right thing," she said. "I know," he said, "but you were the one who saw it." She turned and got in the car and drove. She drove through Highfield and down through the mid-city connector and past the harbor, which was pewter and still in the late afternoon, and past the turn that would take her toward Westridge and Elmcroft Drive, which she didn't take because she wasn't going there today. Today was too full, and the house would wait. She drove to the hotel in Millbrook, and she sat in the parking structure for a moment before going in, not doing anything, just being still. The shape of it was becoming visible to her. Not the full shape. She still couldn't see the end of it, as she'd told Lily, and maybe Lily had been right that there wasn't an end in the way she'd imagined. But the shape of this part, at least. The thing that had been required of her in this city in this month of November, 7 years after she'd left it in the rain. It was more than she'd planned for. Bigger than the acquisition, wider than the boardroom, older than the night of the gala. She was not done yet. But she was beginning to understand what done was going to look like. She got out of the car. She went inside. She called Lily. "How was she?" Lily said. "The mother-in-law?" "Smaller than I remembered," Evelyn said, "and more honest." "Is that enough?" "I don't know," Evelyn said. "I think it might be all there is." She could hear Lily thinking on the other end of the line, the particular quality of Lily's silences, which were not empty but occupied. "You sound different," Lily said, "from this morning." "I feel different," Evelyn said. "Good different or hard different?" She thought about it. "Both," she said. "The kind that's both at once." She ordered room service again. This time she actually ate it. The call from Robert Callaway came on a Tuesday. Evelyn was in the Elmcroft Drive house when her phone rang. She'd been spending mornings there on the days she wasn't needed at the Carver building, slowly making decisions about what the space was going to become, walking the rooms with a notepad, and the particular focused attention she brought to any project that mattered. She'd brought coffee in a thermos. She'd been standing in the kitchen looking at the cabinet pole that didn't match and thinking about what color to repaint the room when the number came up on her screen. Garner's Point area code, a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, then she did. "Miss Carter." The voice was older, careful, with the quality of someone who had thought extensively about what they were going to say and was still not entirely sure they were going to say it right. "My name is Robert Callaway. I believe you know who I am." "I do," she said. "I'm glad you called." A pause. "My daughter told me what was happening with the resolution," he said. "Dana, she called me last week." Another pause, longer. "We haven't spoken regularly for some years. It was not an easy call for either of us." Evelyn moved to stand near the arched window in the dining room. The November garden outside was the same bare and patient thing it had been when she'd looked at it from Constance's house. Late fall in this part of the world had a way of being honest about itself, stripping everything down to what was structurally necessary and leaving the rest for spring to decide. "How is she?" Evelyn said. Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Complicated," he said finally, and there was something in the word that contained years. The specific weight of a father talking about a child who had gone somewhere he couldn't entirely follow. "She made choices I wouldn't have made, but she made them because of something that happened to our family and that—" He stopped. "I'm not sure how to hold both of those things at once." "I'm not sure there's a clean way to hold them," Evelyn said. "No," he said. "I don't think there is." They were quiet together for a moment on the line. She didn't rush it. She'd learned not to rush silences that were doing necessary work. "I want you to know something," Calloway said, "about the resolutions, what the company is proposing." I wasn't going to accept it. When Dana first told me, my immediate response was no, that it was too late, and that money from William Hale's company was money I didn't want regardless of the amount. He paused. "But then she told me who was driving it, who had pushed for it." "It was the right thing," Evelyn said. "It didn't require a particular person to push for it." "Maybe not," he said, "but it required someone who was willing to see it when they didn't have to. Someone who could have walked away from our situation entirely and been justified in doing so." His voice had shifted, not quite emotional, but with the particular texture of a man who had not expected to be on this end of a conversation like this one, and was finding it more than he'd planned for. "I want to understand why you did it." She thought about how to answer that honestly. Not the polished version, not the version that sounded like something a person said when they wanted to appear a certain way, but the actual thing. "Because I know what it feels like to be removed from something you built," she said. "Not in the same way. What happened to you was worse, and older, and I'm not drawing an equivalence. But I understand in some part of myself that isn't theoretical what it costs when someone with more power decides that what's yours is negotiable." She paused. "And I've spent 7 years building something that was genuinely mine, and I know the difference now between things that are earned and things that are taken. I couldn't look at what happened to you and call what I was doing a restructuring, not without addressing it." Calloway was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to accept the resolution," he said. "Not because I've forgiven what was done. I don't know if I'm there, but because my daughter called me and told me about you, and I decided that refusing it was about my pride and not about what was right. That's more self-awareness than most people manage," Evelyn said. "I'm 74, he said. "I've had time." She almost laughed. "Yes," she said. "Time helps." Before he hung up, he said one more thing, in the voice of a man who had decided to say it and was going to say it plainly. "I hope things are better for you now." "They are," she said. Genuinely. She stood at the arched window for a while after the call ended. The garden waited in its November patience. She thought about Dana, Clara Calloway, who became Dana Croft, who at 15 had watched something be taken and had spent the years afterward finding a way to respond to it that made a kind of sense inside whatever she was carrying, even if it produced damage that spread outward in directions she hadn't fully calculated. Evelyn didn't feel warmth toward her. She wasn't going to pretend that was possible. But she felt something that was in the neighborhood of understanding. Not forgiveness, which required more time and more distance than she had, but the specific understanding of a woman who knew what it was to organize your life around a wound and then discover, somewhere in your 40s, that the wound had been running things for longer than you'd realized. That was its own kind of prison. Dana would have to find her own way out of it. Evelyn had her own way out to attend to. December came in cold and clear. The Bird legal challenge collapsed in the second week of December, which was not surprising, but was still satisfying in the way that correct predictions were satisfying. Not exciting, just confirming. The Whitfield and Crane response had been thorough enough that Bird's attorneys had advised their client that the cost of continuing was greater than the probable benefit, and Bird, who was fundamentally a pragmatist, had cut his losses. He sent no communication directly to Evelyn. She hadn't expected him to. The Hale Industries transition was moving the way she'd planned, which meant it was moving imperfectly and slower than the optimistic timeline, but along the right vector. 3 of the middle management layers that had been installed by the Bird partnership were restructured. Two of them were redundant administrative positions, and the restructuring meant eliminating them, which she did with severance packages that were more generous than strictly required because she could afford to be, and because the people in those positions hadn't created the conditions of their own redundancy. Patricia Hahn handled the operational details with the same meticulous efficiency she'd brought to every part of this process. They developed over the weeks a working relationship that was professional and warm without being personal. The good kind of professional relationship, the kind where both parties respected what the other brought and didn't require anything beyond that. Patricia called her Ms. Carter. She called her Patricia. They worked well together. Victor was present through all of it. He'd been true to what he'd said at lunch. Cooperative, not resistant, showing up to meetings and doing the unglamorous work of a man who had accepted that he was no longer the center of gravity in his own company and was finding a way to be useful in the configuration that remained. It wasn't smooth. There were moments when old habits surfaced, when he tried to steer a decision in a way that reflected who he'd been rather than what the situation required. And she'd correct course directly, and he'd accept the correction with something that was between grace and difficulty, which was honest. She didn't need it to be graceful. She needed it to work. She didn't know what his marriage was like now. She didn't ask. There were certain rooms that weren't hers to enter. The idea for what the Elmcroft house would become arrived the way most of her ideas arrived. Sideways, while she was doing something else. She was in the kitchen of the house one morning, waiting for the contractor she'd hired to assess the structural work the building needed, looking at the late December light in the arched windows of the dining room. She'd been thinking about the foundation, the house's literal foundation, which the contractor had flagged in a preliminary walkthrough as solid but needing assessment in one corner of the basement. She'd been thinking about what the word meant in the context of a structure, the thing underneath that everything else depended on, invisible until it wasn't. And she'd been thinking about a woman she'd met 6 weeks earlier through an organization that Cecile worked with on the side. A woman named Rhonda, mid-40s, who had been a marketing director at a regional firm for 11 years and had left a marriage that had cost her most of what she'd built professionally and financially, not through dramatic loss, but through the slow attrition of not mattering, of her contributions being absorbed into someone else's story until she couldn't find herself in her own life anymore. Evelyn had met Rhonda at a benefit dinner, and they'd talked for 40 minutes in the corner of a room while the event went on around them, and Rhonda had said something that Evelyn had been carrying since. The hardest part isn't starting over. The hardest part is figuring out what starting over even means when you don't know what you were actually good at, because no one ever asked. Evelyn had thought someone should ask. And then standing in the kitchen on a December morning waiting for a contractor, looking at the light in the arched windows, she thought, this house should ask. It came together quickly after that. Not because the idea was simple, but because she'd been, without knowing it, preparing for it. The structure was already there. A large residential property with multiple rooms, a location in a city with resources and networks, a set of relationships she'd built over the past month in Harwick that included people like Cecile and Patricia and Gerald Foss, who had more connections to professional and financial support structures than she could build from scratch. She called Owen that afternoon. I want to talk about a foundation, she said. An actual one, nonprofit, purpose, support women in professional and financial transition. Not a shelter, something different. A place where women who've lost their footing can get practical help rebuilding, financial literacy, career development, legal resources, mentorship. Using the Elmcroft property? As the base, yes. It would need renovation. The space would need to be reconfigured, but the bones are there. It's a good building. Owen was quiet for a moment. This is a significant resource commitment. I know. The Aria Sterling Brand Foundation work could support it, and if you structure it properly, there are grant mechanisms that... I know, Owen, she said. I'm not calling you to be talked out of it. I'm calling you because I need the financial structure. A pause. Then, what are you going to call it? She thought about it. She'd been thinking about it since the kitchen, though she hadn't admitted that to herself until right now. She thought about Margaret Quinn's loom and the harbor at 6 in the morning and the way the light came into the dining room of this house and the specific feeling of a woman with a suitcase who doesn't know yet that she's capable of what she's about to do. The Wren Foundation, she said. Small bird, surprising voice. Owen was quiet for a moment. I like it, he said. Don't get sentimental on me. I'm your financial advisor, he said. I'm structurally incapable of sentiment. Tell me what you need. Meg. She went back to Seabrook Cove for Christmas. She drove up on the 23rd, arrived in the late afternoon, and was inside the house 2 blocks from the water before dark. The house smelled like itself. The particular smell of a space that knew her, that she'd filled with things she'd chosen without anyone's input, that had been hers in the cleanest possible sense. She stood in the kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just being in it. Lily came for dinner on Christmas Eve. She brought wine and a dish she'd been experimenting with, a grain salad with roasted vegetables that she said was either very good or a complete disaster. She'd lost the ability to tell. It was very good. They ate at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours and laughed more than either of them had planned to. At one point, Lily said, "Tell me about the foundation." And Evelyn told her, the outline of it, the structure, the vision, the name. Lily listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. "Wren," she said when Evelyn was done. "Yes." "Because of the bird." "Because of the bird." Lily looked at her for a moment. "I want to be involved," she said, "not in a manage Lily's career kind of way. I mean actually involved. I have contacts in the design community who would give time for mentorship, and I can help think through the programming, what women actually need when they're starting over, because I've been through a version of it, and the thing that helped me was you, and I think I understand what you did that mattered." Evelyn looked at her across the table. "What did I do?" she said, because she was genuinely curious. Lily thought about it. "You just assumed I could do more than I thought I could," she said. "That's it, actually. You never performed belief in me. You just operated as if my capability was a given and I'd figure out the rest." She paused. "That's harder to do than it sounds." "Margaret did it for me," Evelyn said. "I know," Lily said. "And now you've done it for about 8 people I can name. The foundation is the next version of that." Evelyn poured more wine. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." She went to see Margaret on Christmas Day. Margaret was in the cooperative. She was always in the cooperative on holidays because she found large gatherings exhausting, and the loom did not require social energy. She had a small tree in the corner that she'd decorated with scraps of her own weaving, which was so exactly like Margaret that Evelyn had to stop and breathe for a moment when she saw it. Margaret looked up when she came in. She put down her shuttle. "You look different," Margaret said. "People keep saying that," Evelyn said, "because it keeps being true." Margaret studied her with the frank attention she brought to everything. The same look she'd turned on Evelyn's first indigo piece, the look that wasn't judging but was genuinely trying to see. "Sit down. Tell me." Evelyn sat on the stool near the work table, the same stool she'd sat on 100 times in the first year, when she'd been bad at things, and Margaret had told her to stop trying to make them good and start trying to listen. She told Margaret about the foundation, about Callaway, about Constance, about the lunch with Victor and the Friday meeting and the way the bird challenge had dissolved. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of her great gifts. When Evelyn was done, she was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Margaret said. "I keep getting asked that," Evelyn said, "because it keeps being the relevant question." Evelyn looked at the loom. The work on it was something she'd never seen Margaret do before. A color combination that was unusual for her. All warm tones, amber and copper, and something closer to red than Margaret typically worked in. It was beautiful in a complicated way, like certain truths were beautiful. "I feel like I went somewhere and came back," Evelyn said slowly. "But the going and the coming back took 7 years, and what I came back to isn't the same place I left. And who came back isn't the same person who left." She paused. "And I don't have a clean word for that. It's not triumph, because triumph implies the other side lost, and I don't actually feel good about anyone losing. It's not peace, because it's not quiet enough for peace." She thought for another moment. "It's closer to integration, like all the pieces of it are finally in the same place at the same time, and I can see how they fit." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's what I hoped for you," she said. "From the beginning. Not the money, not the company. I hoped you'd find that. You never said so." "You weren't ready to hear it," Margaret said. In the beginning, you needed to make things with your hands. The rest followed. It always does with you, Evelyn said. Margaret almost smiled. I'm old, she said. I have the advantage of having watched a lot of things follow. They sat together for a while, in the cooperative with its smell of fiber and dye, and the specific warmth of a room that held years of work in its walls. Outside, Seabrook Cove's Christmas was quiet and cold, the harbor steel gray, the boats at rest, the town doing what small towns did on holidays, pulling inward, becoming briefly more itself. I want to ask you something, Evelyn said. Ask. The foundation. I'd like you to be involved, not in a formal role. I know you don't want that, but as someone we could call on, someone the women who come through could talk to. She paused. You did something for me that I haven't been able to fully name. I want them to have access to whatever that was. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. What did I do? You didn't explain yourself to me, Evelyn said. You didn't give me philosophy or advice or a framework. You asked if I knew how to do anything with my hands. And when I said I had some background, you told me knowing what things were supposed to look like was not the same as making them. And then you showed me the studio and the apartment and left me to figure the rest out. She looked at her. You gave me the room to become something, without telling me what to become. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Yes, she said finally. I'll do that. If they need someone to show them the studio and leave them alone, I can do that. That's exactly what I need, Evelyn said. Woken. She drove back down to Harwick on the 27th. She drove past the harbor, past the Callaway Grand, past the Carver building where the lights on the 31st floor were dark because the offices were closed for the holidays. She drove up into Westridge where the streets were wide and quiet and the houses were large behind their hedges, and she turned onto Elmcroft Drive and pulled into the driveway of her house. She'd hired a contractor who was starting the renovation work in January. The space she'd designed for the Wren Foundation occupied the main floor. The sitting room and dining room reconfigured into meeting and counseling spaces, the kitchen redesigned for shared use, the garden structured for what Margaret had described, when shown the plans, as a place where people could think outside without having to explain what they were thinking about. The upper floors would remain a residence. She'd be using the house on the days she was in Harwick, which would continue to be regular throughout the transition period and likely beyond. She sat in the car for a moment. She thought about the woman who had stood in this driveway in the rain 8 years ago, with one suitcase and a broken heart and no particular idea what was going to happen next. She thought about what she would tell that woman if she could, not what she would have wanted to hear necessarily, but what was actually true. She would tell her, the hardest years are not punishment, they're construction. You don't know that while they're happening because construction looks like destruction from the inside. The foundation being poured looks the same as the building being demolished, if you can't see the whole plan, and you never can see the whole plan while you're living inside it. She would tell her, the people who dismiss you are telling you something useful about themselves, not something definitive about you. What you do with that information is your choice. She would tell her, what you're good at is not gone just because no one is asking for it. It's waiting. It will wait a surprisingly long time. She would tell her, the anger is not your enemy. The anger, properly understood, is information about what matters to you. And if you listen to it instead of drowning it or surrendering to it, it will eventually point you somewhere worth going. She would tell her, you're going to meet a woman who asks if you know how to do anything with your hands, and the answer you give her is going to change your life, and you're not going to know that for months. Pay attention to those moments. They don't announce themselves. She would tell her finally, the thing that was most true and most difficult. It was not enough to survive this. Surviving was the requirement, not the achievement. The achievement was what you made of the survival, whether you let it make you smaller and harder and sealed up against further loss, or whether you let it crack you open in the way that certain materials became stronger at the broken place. She had made mistakes in both directions. She had been harder than necessary for longer than was useful. She had been more afraid than the facts required. She had arrived at what she'd arrived at not in a straight line, but in the lurching, imperfect, frequently embarrassing way of a person who was just human enough to keep getting things wrong on the way to getting something right. That was the truth of it. Not the cinematic version, not the clean arc, but the actual human mess of a woman who had been badly hurt and had rebuilt, badly at first, and then better, and then, finally, imperfectly, into something she could stand inside without apology. She got out of the car. She walked to the front door and unlocked it and went inside. The foyer was quiet in the particular way of a house that was between what it had been and what it was going to be. The wide plank floors caught the winter light from the sidelights. The staircase with the turned balusters she'd refinished herself stood at the far end of the hall, leading up to the rooms that were still empty, still waiting. She walked to the dining room. She stood at the arched windows and looked out at the garden. It was late December, and the garden was bare and cold and honest. The trees were skeletal against the sky. The ground was hard. There was nothing out there that would attract a second look from anyone who didn't know what this kind of garden looked like in April. How suddenly and without much warning it went from stripped and dormant to something that required entirely different words. How the things that survived winter weren't the things that tried to hold on to their leaves. They were the things that let go completely and trusted the structure they'd built underground. She had a meeting on January 3rd with the architect doing the Wren Foundation renovation. She had a board meeting at Hale Industries on January 9th. She had a call with Margaret's doctor, who had flagged some cardiac concerns she was monitoring, on January 11th because Margaret was 75 and had not been taking care of herself with the consistency the situation required, and Evelyn had appointed herself the person who was going to make sure that changed. She had a conversation she hadn't scheduled yet with Lily about what Lily's formal role in the foundation would look like, because Lily had said she wanted to be involved and Evelyn believed her and was going to make sure that happened in a real way and not a token way. She had work, real work, the kind that mattered, and was harder than it looked, and would probably take longer than she planned, and would require her to be patient with herself when she got things wrong and direct about what she needed, and honest with the people around her in the way she hadn't always been when she was younger and more afraid. She had all of that. She also had this, a house on Elmcroft Drive in Harwick City, in the winter, with the light coming through arched windows onto the wide plank floors she'd chosen one careful Saturday morning 11 years ago. A house that had been her home, and then had been taken, and then had been hers again. Not because she'd fought for it out of grief, but because she'd built herself into someone who could choose it, consciously, deliberately, with the full knowledge of its history and her own. She had walked out of this house, into the rain with one suitcase. She had come back with everything else. Not everything she'd imagined she would have at 44, at 40, at 35, when she'd pictured the future in the uncomplicated way of someone who hadn't yet understood what futures cost, and what they required, and what they gave you that you hadn't thought to want. Not that. Something different. Something that was harder to name and more difficult to carry, and more completely hers than anything she could have planned from a standing start. She stood at the window until the winter light started to go, which happened early in December, the sun giving up by 4 o'clock as if it had better things to do. The garden went gray, and then blue, and then dark. The bare trees became shapes against the sky. She didn't turn the lights on right away. She let it be dark for a moment, the way you could afford to let things be dark when you were no longer afraid of what you'd find there. Then she turned on the lights. The dining room filled with warm light. The floors glowed. The arched windows became mirrors showing her back to herself, a woman in a dark coat, alone in a room that was hers, standing in the house she'd chosen in a city she'd returned to by choice, at the end of a day that had been exactly as complicated and real and unresolved as every day before it and every day to come. She looked at herself in the window. She had spent a great deal of her life not quite seeing herself clearly, seeing instead what she wanted to project, or what others needed from her, or the version that was most manageable in the context of whatever room she was in. That had cost her. She wasn't going to pretend it hadn't. But the woman in the window was the woman she'd become after all of it. After the rain in the hotel room and the coastal town and the loom and the dye, and the years of learning to make things, and the acquisition and the boardroom and the lunch at Callum's, and the sitting room in Highfield, and the old man in Garner's Point who had called her on a Tuesday. After all of it, she was not finished. She was not healed in the way that implied no further work required. She was not at peace in the way that implied stillness. She was in motion, building, choosing, making things, standing in rooms and holding her ground, and occasionally making mistakes and going on from them with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had learned that going on was not the same as giving up, and stopping was not the same as rest. She was Evelyn Carter. She had been Evelyn Hale for 11 years, and before that, Evelyn Carter for 33. And somewhere in a coastal town in a studio that smelled like indigo, she had been briefly Arya Sterling. And all of those were true, and none of them were the complete story. The complete story was still being written. She had a long time left and a great deal she intended to do with it, and the woman in the window looking back at her knew that, had the specific look of someone who knew that, and was not afraid of it. She picked up her phone. She called Lily. "I'm at the house," she said. "How does it feel?" Lily said. She looked around the dining room, the light, the floors, the windows that had been the reason she'd known, once, in an empty house on a Saturday morning, that this was where she was supposed to be. "Right," she said. "It feels exactly right." She meant the house. She meant the city. She meant the work waiting for her in January and the foundation and the woman in Garner's Point who didn't know yet that Evelyn was going to reach out, and the conversation with Margaret about her cardiac monitoring, and the renovation starting next week, and all the ordinary, difficult, specific days that were going to follow this one in the way that days always did. Not dramatically, not cleanly, but real and present and requiring her full attention. All of it. It felt right. She stayed in the house until late that night, long after Lily had gone to bed, and the city had gone quiet around her. She sat on the floor of the sitting room. There was still no furniture, just the floors and the walls and the windows. And she sat there in the quiet of a house that was becoming something. And she thought about nothing in particular, and she was not lonely, and she was not afraid. Outside, Harwick City did what it always did. Went on, in the particular indifferent way of cities, without knowing or caring what had happened inside one of its houses on a December night. Cars on the streets, lights in the windows of other houses where other people were living the complicated private interiors of their own lives. All of those lives running parallel and invisible to each other, each of them as layered and imperfect and unresolved as hers. That was the thing, in the end. That was what she'd learned and kept learning and suspected she would never completely finish learning, that no one's story was as simple as it looked from outside it. That the woman who stood in a ballroom and absorbed a public humiliation without making a scene was also the woman who had been making herself invisible for years before that night. That the man who had ended his marriage out loud in a room full of people was also a man who had inherited a company built on someone else's loss and had never found the courage to look at it directly until he had no choice. That a 15-year-old girl who watched her family lose everything had become a woman who responded to that loss in ways that cost other people things they hadn't chosen to lose. And that was true. And was not the whole truth, and would never be the whole truth. People were not their worst moments. They were also not their best ones. They were the accumulated sum of all of it. The choices made from fear and the ones made from courage, and the ones that couldn't be cleanly categorized as either, which was most of them. They were the things they'd built and the things they'd let fall, and the things they'd gone back and tried to repair, imperfectly, later than they should have, with the tools they had by then instead of the ones they'd needed at the time. She had been all of those things. She expected she would continue to be. She got up from the floor eventually, when her joints suggested it was time. She turned off the lights. She locked the front door behind her. She stood on the front steps for a moment in the December cold, looking at the street, quiet and dark and ordinary. The kind of street that asked nothing of you and offered nothing dramatic, just pavement and hedges and the distant suggestion of the harbor beyond the rooflines. She had left this street in the rain 8 years ago with one suitcase. She was leaving it now on a clear December night, with her keys in her pocket and her phone in her hand, and a January full of work she'd chosen for herself. And the distance between those two departures was not measurable in years or money or any of the obvious metrics. It was measurable in this. She knew who she was now. She hadn't known then. That was everything. It was also enough. She walked to her car. She drove to the hotel. She slept without difficulty, without the 3 a.m. reckonings that had visited her for the first 2 years after the ballroom, and in the morning she got up and made coffee and opened her laptop and went to work. It was, in every way that mattered, the beginning.